a land where prehistoric hunters painted masterpieces on cave walls 17,000 years ago, where Celtic warriors faced Roman legions in epic battles, where medieval knights built soaring cathedrals that still take your breath away, where revolution literally changed the world, and where Napoleon's ambitions reshaped an entire continent, where 2 world wars brought devastation and rebirth, where fashion, cuisine, art, and philosophy became global languages. This is France, a nation whose story reads like the most dramatic novel ever written, except every word is true. From the misty forests of ancient Gaul to the gleaming halls of the European Union, France has been at the center of Western civilization for over 2 millennia. Today we're going to journey through every chapter of this incredible saga, the triumphs and tragedies, the heroes and villains, the moments of glory and the depths of despair that forged one of the world's most influential nations. Welcome to the complete history of France. Prehistoric France and Celtic Gaul, prehistory 58 BC. Long before France existed as a concept, before Romans ever set foot on its soil, this land between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean was already writing history in stone, bone, and blood. The story begins not with kings or emperors, but with our prehistoric ancestors who left their mark in ways that still astound us today. Deep in the caves of Lascaux, discovered by 4 teenagers in 1940, lies one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. These paintings, created around 17,000 years ago during the Paleolithic period, show horses, deer, and aurochs rendered with such skill and vitality that they seem ready to leap from the cave walls. These were not primitive scratches. They were sophisticated works of art that used the natural contours of the cave to create 3-dimensional effects, showing that artistic genius has always been part of the human spirit in this land. The prehistoric inhabitants of what would become France weren't just artists. They were innovators. At sites like Pansavent and Etiolo, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies that tracked reindeer migrations with mathematical precision, created specialized tools for different seasons, and developed complex social structures. These people survived ice ages, adapted to changing climates, and laid the groundwork for all future civilizations in this region. As the ice retreated and the Neolithic period began around 6000 BC, these hunter-gatherers gradually gave way to farmers who brought revolutionary changes. They built megalithic monuments like the alignments at Carnac in Brittany, over 3,000 standing stones arranged in mysterious patterns that still puzzle archaeologists today. These monuments required massive community cooperation and sophisticated understanding of astronomy and engineering, proving that organized, complex societies existed in France thousands of years before written history. But the real transformation came with the Celts, who arrived in waves starting around 800 BC and gave this land its first recognizable identity. The Celtic tribes, the Gauls, as the Romans called them, weren't a single people, but a collection of related groups, the Aedui, the Arverni, the Helvetii, and dozens of others, each with their own territories, customs, and fierce independence. Celtic Gaul was far from the barbarian wilderness that Roman propaganda often portrayed. The Celts were master metalworkers who created intricate jewelry, weapons, and tools that rivaled anything produced in the Mediterranean world. They built substantial settlements called oppida, fortified towns like Bibracte and Gergovia that were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and political power. Archaeological evidence shows these settlements had organized streets, markets, workshops, and even primitive banking systems. The Gauls were also skilled traders who maintained commercial networks stretching from Britain to the Black Sea. They traded amber from the Baltic, tin from Cornwall, and their own excellent metalwork throughout Europe. Roman merchants were already familiar with Gallic goods long before Roman soldiers arrived to conquer the land. Politically, Celtic Gaul was a complex patchwork of tribal territories, each jealously guarding its independence while maintaining shifting alliances with neighbors. They had druids who served as judges, teachers, and priests, maintaining oral traditions that preserved laws, history, and religious practices across generations. These druids were so respected that they could stop battles by walking between opposing armies. The Celtic religion was deeply connected to nature, with sacred groves, springs, and mountains serving as temples. They practiced human sacrifice on important occasions, a practice that horrified Romans but was deeply meaningful within Celtic cosmology. Their gods were numerous and complex: Teutots the protector, Isis the woodsman, Tyrannus the thunder god, each representing different aspects of the natural and supernatural world. What made Celtic Gaul particularly vulnerable to Roman conquest wasn't weakness, but division. Despite sharing language, culture, and religion, the tribes could never unite for long. Personal rivalries, territorial disputes, and competing ambitions meant that when Rome finally came calling in 58 BC, the Gauls would face the legions not as a united nation, but as a collection of proud, brave, but ultimately isolated tribes. This disunity would prove fatal when an ambitious Roman general named Gaius Julius Caesar decided that conquering Gaul would be his pathway to supreme power in Rome. The stage was set for a confrontation that would end the Celtic Age and begin the long process of creating what would eventually become France. Roman Gaul, the foundation of civilization, 58 BC, 486 AD. The year 58 BC marked the beginning of one of history's most consequential conquests. Julius Caesar, ambitious and in debt, needed military glory and wealth to advance his political career in Rome. Gaul, with its rich resources and divided tribes, seemed like the perfect target. What Caesar probably did not anticipate was that his Gallic wars would not only make his career, but would also lay the foundations for a future nation called France. Caesar's conquest wasn't a simple military steamroll. The Gallic Wars, which lasted 8 bloody years, were a complex campaign of diplomacy, siege warfare, and psychological manipulation. Caesar was a master at exploiting tribal rivalries, convincing some Gallic leaders to ally with Rome against their traditional enemies. He used Roman engineering to build bridges, siege works, and fortifications with a speed that awed and terrified his opponents. The most famous episode came in 52 BC when the Arverni chieftain Vercingetorix managed to do what had seemed impossible: unite the Gallic tribes against Rome. Vercingetorix was everything a Celtic hero should be: young, charismatic, brave, and utterly committed to Gallic freedom. He adopted guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles and using scorched earth policies to deny Caesar's legions supplies. The climax came at Alesia, a hilltop fortress where Vercingetorix made his final stand. Caesar's siege of Alesia was a masterpiece of military engineering. He built 2 rings of fortifications, one to keep the Gauls in and another to keep relief armies out. When the relief army arrived, Caesar found himself fighting enemies on 2 fronts while protecting his own men in the middle. It was the kind of impossible situation that made reputations, and Caesar's victory at Alesia became legendary. Vercingetorix's surrender was both noble and tragic. According to Caesar's own account, the Gallic leader dressed in his finest armor and rode out of Alesia alone to surrender himself, hoping to save his people from massacre. He was taken to Rome, paraded in Caesar's triumph, and then strangled in the traditional Roman manner. But his legend lived on, and nearly 2,000 years later, Napoleon III would erect a massive statue of Vercingetorix at Alesia, making him a symbol of French resistance to foreign occupation. With Gaul conquered, Rome began the long process of Romanization that would transform Celtic society forever. But this was not simple cultural imperialism. It was a complex process of give and take that created something entirely new. The Romans brought roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and baths, but they also absorbed Celtic traditions, gods, and customs. Roman Gaul became one of the empire's most prosperous provinces. Cities like Lugdunum, Lyon, Burdigala, Bordeaux, and Lutetia, Paris, grew into major commercial centers. The Roman road system connected these cities in a network that made trade, travel, and communication faster and more reliable than ever before. Some of these roads were so well built that they remained major transportation routes well into the modern era. The Romans brought their language, Latin, which gradually displaced Celtic tongues in most areas. But Latin in Gaul wasn't the pure language of Cicero. It was a popular, evolving tongue that absorbed Celtic words and developed its own character. This Gallo-Roman Latin would eventually evolve into Old French, making modern French a direct descendant of the language spoken by Roman soldiers and merchants in ancient Gaul. Religion in Roman Gaul became a fascinating blend of traditions. The Romans identified Celtic gods with their own. Teutates became Mercury, Esus became Mars, Tyrannus became Jupiter. But they also allowed purely Celtic traditions to continue, especially in rural areas where Druids maintained ancient practices in secret. Christianity arrived in the 2nd century AD, initially in the cities and among the educated classes, gradually spreading to the countryside over the following centuries. The late Roman period in Gaul was marked by increasing challenges. Barbarian tribes pressed against the Rhine frontier, requiring constant military vigilance. The economic burden of defending the empire grew heavier, leading to higher taxes and social tensions. The empire itself was often racked by civil wars as various generals competed for the purple. By the 3rd century, Gaul was experiencing the same problems as the rest of the Roman Empire: military anarchy, economic decline, and barbarian invasions. The crisis reached its peak when Gallic nobles actually established their own Gallic Empire from 260 to 274 AD, with emperors ruling from Trier and Augusta Treverorum. Though this breakaway empire was eventually suppressed, it showed that Gaul was developing its own distinct identity within the Roman world. The 4th and 5th centuries saw increasing barbarian settlement within Roman Gaul. These weren't necessarily invasions in the traditional sense. Often they were more like organized immigration, with barbarian tribes being granted land in exchange for military service. Visigoths settled in Aquitaine, Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, and Franks in the northeast. These groups gradually adopted Roman customs while maintaining their own warrior traditions. The end of Roman rule in Gaul wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a gradual transition. The last Roman governors found themselves increasingly dependent on barbarian allies, who eventually simply took over. In 486 AD, Clovis, king of the Franks, defeated Syagrius, the last Roman governor in northern Gaul, at the Battle of Soissons. It was the end of Roman Gaul, but it was also the beginning of something new, a kingdom that would eventually become France. The Merovingian dynasty, forging a Frankish kingdom, 481-751 AD. When Clovis III became king of the Salian Franks in 481 AD, he inherited a small kingdom around modern-day Belgium and northern France. When he died in 501, he ruled most of what is now France, and had set in motion the forces that would create the first recognizably French kingdom. The Merovingian dynasty that Clovis founded would rule for nearly 3 centuries, transforming a barbarian tribe into a Christian kingdom that became the cornerstone of medieval Europe. Clovis was a political genius who understood that successful conquest required more than military might. It required legitimacy. His masterstroke was his conversion to Catholic Christianity around 496 AD, following his victory at the Battle of Tolbiac. According to legend, Clovis prayed to his wife Clotilde's god during the battle, promising to convert if granted victory. Whether or not the story is true, the conversion was politically brilliant. While other barbarian kingdoms had adopted Arian Christianity, which the Catholic Church considered heretical, Clovis embraced Orthodox Catholicism. This immediately gave him the support of the Gallo-Roman population, who saw him not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a legitimate Christian ruler. Bishop Remigius of Reims baptized Clovis along with 3,000 of his warriors in a ceremony that symbolically united Frankish military power with Roman Christian civilization. The conversion also gave Clovis a powerful ally in the Catholic Church, which was becoming the dominant institution in post-Roman Gaul. Bishops like Gregory of Tours became chroniclers of Frankish history, ensuring that Clovis and his successors would be remembered as righteous Christian kings rather than barbarian warlords. The alliance between the Frankish crown and the Catholic Church would remain a defining feature of French politics for the next 13 centuries. Clovis expanded his kingdom through a combination of conquest, diplomacy, and what can only be called organized treachery. He eliminated rival Frankish kings through methods that would have impressed Machiavelli, inviting them to meetings, and then having them murdered, convincing their own followers to betray them, or simply attacking when they least expected it. By 509, Clovis had united all the Frankish tribes under his rule and eliminated the Visigothic kingdom of Toulouse, pushing Visigothic power south of the Pyrenees. However, Clovis also established what would become a chronic problem for the Merovingian dynasty, the practice of dividing the kingdom among royal sons. Frankish law treated the kingdom as personal property to be inherited equally by all legitimate male heirs. When Clovis died in 511, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, creating the sub-kingdoms of Paris, Orléans, Soissons, and Reims. This division led to nearly 2 centuries of civil war as Merovingian princes fought each other for supremacy. The fratricidal conflicts were made worse by the influence of powerful queens like Brunhild and Fredegund, whose rivalry turned personal vendetta into dynastic warfare. Gregory of Tours' chronicles read like a medieval soap opera, full of assassinations, betrayals, and revenge plots that would have made Shakespeare envious. Despite the constant warfare, Merovingian Gaul experienced significant cultural and economic development. The Franks were skilled at adapting and preserving Roman institutions while adding their own innovations. Roman law continued to apply to the Gallo-Roman population, while Franks lived under their traditional law code, the Lex Salica. This legal pluralism created a complex but functional system that accommodated different ethnic groups within the same kingdom. The Merovingian economy was primarily agricultural, but trade networks remained active throughout the period. Frankish merchants maintained connections with the Byzantine Empire, Anglo-Saxon England, and even distant lands like India and China. Archaeological evidence shows that luxury goods from across the known world reached Merovingian courts, indicating that the kingdom was far from the isolated backwater often portrayed in older histories. Monasticism flourished under the Merovingians, with Irish and Anglo-Saxon missionaries establishing monasteries throughout the kingdom. Saint Columban founded influential monasteries at Luxeuil and Bobbio, while Saint Éloi became both a master craftsman and a bishop. These monasteries became centers of learning, art, and economic development, preserving classical knowledge while developing new forms of Christian culture. The later Merovingian period saw the rise of the mayors of the palace, officials who gradually took over the real power, while the kings became ceremonial figures. The most famous of these mayors was Charles Martel, who won lasting fame by defeating a Muslim invasion force at the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, in 732. This victory stopped Muslim expansion into Western Europe and made Charles Martel a hero throughout Christian Europe. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, would eventually formalize what had become reality. In 751, with papal approval, he deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and founded the Carolingian dynasty. The Merovingians had ruled for 270 years, long enough to establish the basic framework of a Frankish kingdom that would evolve into France. The Merovingian legacy was profound and lasting. They created the first stable kingdom on Frankish soil, established the alliance between crown and church that would define French monarchy, and began the process of cultural synthesis that would produce medieval European civilization. Their kingdom provided the territorial and institutional foundation upon which their Carolingian successors would build an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Elbe River. Most importantly, the Merovingians established the idea that this land between the Rhine and the Atlantic was a single political entity, a kingdom with its own identity, laws, and destiny. When later historians looked back to find the origins of France, they would trace them to Clovis and his successors, the long-haired kings who first united the Franks and gave their name to what would become one of Europe's greatest nations. The Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne's dream, 751–987 AD. On Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, in the magnificent Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of a towering Frankish king named Charles. The assembled crowd erupted in acclamation. "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans, life and victory!" In that moment, the Roman Empire was reborn in the West, and a new chapter in European history began. The man the world would remember as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, had become the first Western emperor in over 3 centuries. But this extraordinary moment was the culmination of a process that began 50 years earlier when Pepin the Short, with papal blessing, deposed the last Merovingian king. The Carolingian dynasty didn't just inherit the Frankish throne, they revolutionized it, transforming a Germanic kingdom into a Christian empire that would reshape medieval Europe and lay the groundwork for both France and Germany. Charlemagne, who ruled from 768 to 814, was a force of nature. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, he possessed the physical presence to match his enormous ambitions. Contemporary chronicles describe him as powerfully built, with piercing eyes and a booming voice that could command attention across a crowded hall. But it was his mind, not just his body, that made him great. Charlemagne's conquests were staggering in scope. He conquered the Lombard kingdom in Italy, making himself king of the Lombards. He fought 32 campaigns against the pagan Saxons, finally converting them to Christianity through a combination of military pressure and strategic evangelization. He pushed into Spain, establishing the Spanish March as a buffer against Muslim forces. He campaigned against the Avars in Hungary, bringing vast treasures back to enrich his kingdom. By the end of his reign, Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Danube River, from the North Sea to central Italy. The famous Song of Roland, France's greatest medieval epic, commemorates one of Charlemagne's few military setbacks, the destruction of his rearguard, led by his nephew Roland, at the pass of Roncevaux in 778. While the historical reality was an ambush by Basque mountaineers angry about Frankish raids, the legend transformed it into a heroic Christian last stand against Muslim invaders, creating one of the most powerful myths in French literature. But Charlemagne was more than a conqueror. He was a reformer who understood that lasting power required more than military might. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians call it, was a deliberate attempt to revive learning, arts, and good governance throughout the empire. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe at his court in Aachen, Alcuin from England, Theodulf from Spain, Paul the Deacon from Italy. These men didn't just preserve classical learning, they reformed education, standardized liturgy, and created a new form of handwriting, Carolingian minuscule, that became the foundation for modern European scripts. The Palace School at Aachen became a center of learning that attracted students from across Europe. Charlemagne himself, though probably illiterate by modern standards, was deeply committed to education and intellectual development. He could speak Latin and understood Greek, engaged in theological debates with the greatest minds of his age, and insisted that all clergy in his empire be properly educated. His capitularies, royal decrees, show a ruler obsessed with good governance, covering everything from weights and measures to moral behavior. Charlemagne's relationship with the papacy was complex and often tense. While he was crowned emperor by the Pope, he made it clear that he considered himself God's chosen ruler, responsible directly to the Almighty for the welfare of his Christian people. He intervened in theological disputes, reformed the clergy, and even criticized papal policies when he thought them wrong. This tension between secular and religious authority would echo through French history for centuries to come. The empire Charlemagne built was held together by his personal charisma and administrative genius, but it contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The Frankish practice of dividing inheritance among sons meant that the empire was destined to fragment after his death. When Charlemagne died in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited an intact empire, but Louis lacked his father's commanding presence and political skill. The crisis came to a head with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when Louis's three sons divided the empire among themselves. Charles the Bald received the western portion, which would become France. Louis the German received the eastern portion, which would become Germany, and Lothair received the Middle Kingdom stretching from the Low Countries to Italy, which would prove too unwieldy to survive intact. This division was more than just a family settlement. It reflected deeper linguistic and cultural differences that had been developing within the empire. The famous Strasbourg Oaths of 842, sworn by Charles the Bald and Louis the German against their brother Lothair, were recorded in both Old French and Old High German, showing that the empire's subjects could no longer understand a single common language. The later Carolingian period saw increasing pressure from Viking raids, Muslim incursions, and Hungarian invasions. The famous siege of Paris by Vikings in 885-886 showed both the weakness of central authority and the growing importance of local leaders who could provide effective defense. Count Odo of Paris, who successfully defended the city, represented a new type of leader, a territorial magnate whose power came from controlling land and providing protection rather than from royal appointment. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the Carolingian kings had become largely ceremonial figures, while real power lay in the hands of great nobles who controlled vast territories and private armies. The feudal system that would define medieval Europe was emerging from the wreckage of Charlemagne's empire. The last Carolingian king of France, Louis V, died in 987 without an heir, bringing the dynasty to an end. But the Carolingian legacy lived on in the idea of a Christian empire, in the revival of learning and culture, and in the territorial framework that would shape European development for centuries. When the nobles of France chose Hugh Capet as their new king in 987, they were building on foundations that Charlemagne and his successors had laid 2 centuries earlier. The birth of feudalism and the Capetian rise, 987-1108 AD. The year 987 marked a turning point in French history that contemporaries could barely have imagined. When the great nobles of France gathered to choose a new king after the death of the last Carolingian, they selected Hugh Capet, a relatively minor count whose greatest asset was that he posed no threat to anyone. They thought they were choosing a weak figurehead who would leave them free to rule their own territories as they pleased. Instead, they had just founded a dynasty that would rule France for over 8 centuries and transform a feudal patchwork into one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Hugh Capet's election represented the triumph of a new form of political organization that was emerging from the chaos of the late Carolingian period. Feudalism, though medieval people never used that term, was a system based on personal relationships, land tenure, and military service that had evolved as a practical response to the breakdown of central authority. In a world where royal armies could no longer provide effective protection, local strongmen stepped in to fill the gap. The feudal system was elegantly simple in theory, but bewilderingly complex in practice. At its heart was the relationship between lord and vassal, sealed by an oath of homage and fealty. A vassal knelt before his lord, placed his hands between the lord's hands, and swore to serve faithfully in exchange for a grant of land called a fief. This created a pyramid of obligations stretching from the king at the top down to the humblest knight at the bottom. But feudalism wasn't just about military service. It was a complete social and economic system. The vast majority of the population were peasants who worked the land, bound to their lords by relationships that ranged from relatively free contracts to outright serfdom. These peasants provided the agricultural surplus that supported the warrior class, who in turn provided protection and justice. It was a system that could function effectively even when central government collapsed entirely. When Hugh Capet became king, he controlled directly only a small territory around Paris and Orléans, the Île-de-France. Great vassals like the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Flanders, and the Duke of Aquitaine controlled territories far larger and richer than the royal domain. The Duke of Normandy could field larger armies, the Count of Toulouse controlled more cities, and the Duke of Burgundy had more castles than the king himself. What Hugh Capet did have was legitimacy. The crown, even when worn by a weak king, carried mystical authority that no mere duke or count could match. The anointing ceremony, performed at Reims Cathedral with holy oil supposedly brought by an angel, made the king God's representative on earth. This sacred character of kingship would prove to be a powerful tool in the hands of capable Capetian rulers. Hugh Capet's early reign was precarious. He faced challenges from the last Carolingian claimant, Charles of Lorraine, and from powerful vassals who tested his resolve. But Hugh made a crucial decision that ensured his dynasty's survival. He had his son Robert crowned as co-king while he was still alive, establishing the principle of hereditary succession and preventing the nobles from choosing someone else when he died. The early Capetians were forced to be pragmatic. They couldn't hope to control their great vassals through force, so they used other methods: careful marriage alliances, exploitation of feudal law, and above all, patient accumulation of territory and rights. When vassals died without heirs, their fiefs could revert to the crown. When marriages failed to produce children, the king might gain new claims. When nobles committed feudal offenses, their lands could be forfeit. Robert the Pious, 996–1031, Hugh Capet's son, exemplified this patient approach. A deeply religious man who founded monasteries and promoted church reform, Robert also quietly extended royal influence through marriage alliances and careful legal maneuvering. His reign saw the beginning of the Capetian policy of supporting church reform as a way to gain moral authority and practical influence. The reign of Henry I, 1031–1060, demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of early Capetian power. Henry successfully intervened in the succession dispute in Normandy, helping William the Bastard, later William the Conqueror, secure his duchy. This intervention created a debt that would have profound consequences for French history, as William's conquest of England in 1066 made the Norman Duke also King of England, creating a vassal who was more powerful than his lord. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Europe. William the Conqueror now held the English crown, making him theoretically equal to the King of France, while simultaneously holding Normandy as a fief from the French crown. This dual status created a contradiction that would lead to centuries of conflict between the English and French monarchies. Philip I, 1060–1108, inherited this complicated situation and had to deal with vassals who were becoming increasingly powerful and independent. The Duke of Aquitaine controlled most of southwestern France. The Count of Flanders dominated the textile trade that was making northern Europe wealthy, and the Norman dukes, now also kings of England, had resources that dwarfed those of the French crown. Yet Philip I also presided over the beginning of economic and social changes that would eventually strengthen the monarchy. The 11th century saw a dramatic increase in population, the founding of new towns, and the expansion of trade. New agricultural techniques increased food production, while the development of watermills and windmills showed technological innovation. The famous medieval fairs of Champagne began during this period, making France a crucial link in European commerce. The First Crusade, launched in 1095, revealed both the spiritual authority of the monarchy and its practical limitations. When Pope Urban II called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem, thousands of French nobles responded enthusiastically. But they organized themselves independently, with great vassals like Raymond of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon leading their own contingents. The king himself did not participate, showing that royal authority had limits even in spiritual matters. The crusading movement did, however, benefit the monarchy in unexpected ways. Many nobles mortgaged or sold their lands to finance their expeditions, allowing the king and other lords to acquire property. The absence of so many warriors also reduced the level of local warfare that had plagued France for generations. By the end of Philip I's reign in 1108, the Capetian dynasty had survived for over a century and established important precedents. The principle of hereditary succession was firmly established. The sacred character of kingship was universally recognized, and the royal domain, though still small, was compact and defensible. Most importantly, the Capetians had learned to work within the feudal system rather than against it, using feudal law and custom to gradually expand their authority. The stage was set for the next phase of Capetian expansion under Louis VI the Fat, who would begin the systematic process of extending royal power that would eventually transform France from a feudal confederation into a unified kingdom under royal authority. The Awakening Giant, Louis VII and the Growth of Royal Power, 1108-1180. The 12th century dawned with France poised on the edge of greatness, though few contemporaries could have predicted the dramatic transformation about to unfold. Under Louis VI the Fat, 1108-1137, and his son Louis VII, 1137-1180, the Capetian monarchy began to emerge from its feudal cocoon, developing the institutions, resources, and authority that would make it the dominant power in medieval Europe. This was the century when France truly began to awaken as a unified kingdom, even as it faced its greatest challenge yet from the emerging Angevin Empire. Louis VI, nicknamed the Fat, not for obesity, but for his robust, imposing presence, was the first Capetian king to truly understand the potential of royal power. Where his predecessors had been content to survive and maintain their dignity, Louis VI actively sought to expand royal authority and establish the monarchy as the supreme feudal lord in France. His reign marked the beginning of what historians call the expansion of the royal domain, a systematic campaign to bring more territory under direct royal control. Louis VI's strategy was brilliantly simple. He focused first on pacifying and organizing his own royal domain, the Île-de-France, before attempting to control distant vassals. The region around Paris had been plagued by robber barons who operated from stone castles, terrorizing merchants, pilgrims, and peasants with impunity. These petty tyrants, men like Thomas de Marle and Bouchard de Montmorency, had turned parts of the royal domain into lawless wastelands where might made right. Louis XVI systematically hunted down these castle lords, besieging their fortresses with new military technologies, including improved siege engines and crossbows. His biographer, Suger of Saint-Denis, describes dramatic scenes of the king personally leading assaults on rebel castles, his royal banner streaming in the wind as he brought justice to the oppressed. This wasn't just military action. It was royal theater, designed to show that the king was the protector of his people and the source of justice. The transformation of the Île-de-France had profound economic consequences. With the roads safe and commerce protected, trade flourished as never before. Markets expanded, new towns were founded, and agricultural productivity increased. The royal domain became a model of good governance that attracted settlers and generated the revenues that would fund further expansion. Louis VI also revolutionized the relationship between the monarchy and the church. His close advisor, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, was one of the most brilliant political minds of the medieval period. Suger understood that the monarchy needed both spiritual legitimacy and practical support from the church. He promoted the idea that the king was God's anointed representative, responsible for maintaining peace and justice in his realm. The partnership between Louis VI and Suger produced one of the most magnificent expressions of medieval spirituality, the rebuilding of the Abbey of Saint-Denis in the revolutionary New Gothic style. The church, completed under Suger's direction, featured pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and enormous windows filled with jewel-like stained glass that transformed sunlight into divine radiance. This architectural innovation wasn't just aesthetic, it was theological, designed to create a physical representation of the heavenly Jerusalem on earth. When Louis VI died in 1137, he was succeeded by his son Louis VII, a man of very different temperament but equal determination to strengthen the monarchy. Where Louis VI had been a warrior king, Louis VII was more of an intellectual and mystic, deeply religious, and committed to the ideals of Christian kingship. His reign would be marked by both spectacular achievements and devastating setbacks. Louis VII's early reign was dominated by his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the medieval period. Eleanor brought to the marriage the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, which included most of southwestern France. This union briefly made the Capetian monarchy the dominant power in France, controlling territory from the English Channel to the Pyrenees. Eleanor was no ordinary medieval queen. Intelligent, educated, and strong-willed, she had been raised in the sophisticated court culture of Aquitaine, where troubadour poetry and courtly love were flourishing. She brought to the rather austere Capetian court a new emphasis on culture, literature, and refined manners that would have lasting influence on French civilization. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning. Louis VII, despite his political acumen, was a deeply pious man who took his religious obligations seriously, sometimes to the detriment of practical politics. Eleanor, raised in the more relaxed atmosphere of southern France, found the northern court stifling and overly moralistic. Their personalities clashed repeatedly, and their marriage became a source of political tension. The crisis came during the Second Crusade, 1147-1149, which Louis VII joined with Eleanor at his side. The crusade was a disaster militarily, but it was even more catastrophic for the royal marriage. In Antioch, Eleanor's behavior with her uncle Raymond sparked rumors of adultery that scandalized the crusading army. Whether or not the rumors were true, they destroyed any remaining affection between the royal couple. The marriage's end came in 1152, when Louis VII and Eleanor obtained an annulment on grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related according to church law. It seemed like a reasonable solution to a failed marriage, but it turned out to be one of the greatest political disasters in French history. 2 months after the annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and heir to the English throne. When Henry became King Henry II of England in 1154, he ruled an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The Angevin Empire, as historians call it, included England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through Eleanor, Aquitaine. Henry II now controlled more French territory than the King of France himself, creating a strategic nightmare that would dominate French politics for the next century. Louis VII spent the rest of his reign trying to contain Angevin power. He supported Henry II's rebellious sons when they revolted against their father, exploited every succession crisis in the Angevin lands, and formed alliances with anyone willing to oppose English power. This struggle taught the French monarchy crucial lessons about statecraft, diplomacy, and the importance of having reliable military and financial resources. Despite the Angevin challenge, Louis VII's reign saw continued expansion of royal authority within France. He extended royal justice through a network of royal officials called prévôts, who administered justice and collected revenues in the king's name. He founded new towns, granted charters to existing communities, and promoted trade and commerce. The famous fairs of Champagne reached their peak during his reign, making France the commercial crossroads of Europe. Louis VII also presided over the flowering of what historians call the 12th century Renaissance. The University of Paris was emerging as Europe's premier center of learning, attracting students from across Europe to study theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. The Cathedral School of Notre Dame became famous for its innovative theological scholarship, while the Abbey of Saint-Victor developed new forms of mystical theology. When Louis VII died in 1180, he left his son Philip Augustus a kingdom that was still threatened by the Angevin Empire, but was stronger, richer, and better organized than any previous Capetian monarch had inherited. The institutions of royal government were developing, the royal domain was expanding, and the principle of royal authority was firmly established. The stage was set for the next phase of Capetian expansion under Philip Augustus, who would prove to be one of the greatest kings in French history. Philip Augustus and the Triumph of Royal Power, 1180–1223. In the annals of French history, few reigns shine as brilliantly as that of Philip II, known to posterity as Philip Augustus. When he ascended the throne in 1180 at age 15, France was overshadowed by the mighty Angevin Empire of Henry II of England. When Philip died in 1223, France had become the dominant power in Western Europe, and the Capetian monarchy had established itself as the strongest royal house in Christendom. This transformation was no accident. It was the result of 43 years of brilliant statecraft, military innovation, and relentless ambition by a king who understood that survival required not just adaptation, but domination. Philip Augustus inherited a kingdom under siege. The Angevin Empire controlled more than half of what we now consider France, and Henry II of England possessed resources that dwarfed those of the French crown. Henry ruled from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, commanded the wealth of England and the strategic ports of Normandy, and had proven himself one of the most capable rulers of his generation. Against this colossus, the young French king had only his compact royal domain around Paris, and the theoretical loyalty of vassals who often seemed more impressed by Angevin power than Capetian legitimacy. But Philip Augustus possessed something his enemies consistently underestimated: a brilliant strategic mind combined with infinite patience and ruthless pragmatism. Where previous Capetian kings had reacted to Angevin moves, Philip would learn to set the agenda, exploit his enemies' weaknesses, and turn their strengths against them. Philip's first great opportunity came with the Third Crusade, 1189–1192, launched in response to Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem. The crusade brought together the three greatest rulers of Western Europe: Philip Augustus of France, Richard the Lionheart of England, who had succeeded his father Henry II, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. It should have been a moment of Christian unity, but Philip turned it into a diplomatic masterstroke. While Richard threw himself into the military campaign with characteristic impetuosity, Philip played a longer game. He fulfilled his crusading vow by capturing Acre, then returned to France early, claiming illness. This gave him a crucial advantage. While Richard was winning glory in the Holy Land, Philip was quietly undermining Angevin power in France. He cultivated relationships with Richard's continental vassals, exploited local grievances, and began the systematic legal and military campaign that would eventually destroy the Angevin Empire. Philip's strategy was ingenious in its sophistication. Rather than simply declaring war on the Angevin domains, he used feudal law as a weapon. As overlord of Richard's French fiefs, Philip had the legal right to summon his vassal to court to answer charges. When Richard, and later his brother John, failed to appear, Philip could legally declare their fiefs forfeit. This wasn't mere legalism. It was revolutionary political warfare that turned the feudal system against itself. The key moment came in 1202 when John Lackland, who had succeeded Richard in 1199, made a crucial error. John's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême enraged the Lusignan family, who appealed to Philip as their feudal overlord. Philip summoned John to court to answer charges, and when John refused to appear, Philip declared all his French fiefs forfeit. The legal groundwork for conquest was complete. What followed was one of the most brilliant military campaigns in medieval history. Philip didn't simply invade Normandy with overwhelming force. He systematically dismantled Angevin power through a combination of siege warfare, diplomatic subversion, and psychological pressure. He captured key fortresses like Gaillard, Richard's beautiful castle, that was supposed to guard Normandy forever. He won over Norman nobles who had grown tired of absentee English rule. He exploited the financial difficulties that constant warfare had created for the Angevin treasury. The conquest of Normandy in 1204 was more than a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake that transformed European politics. For over 130 years, Norman dukes had been among the most powerful rulers in Europe. Their sudden collapse showed that no power, however mighty, was immune to strategic pressure and patient undermining. But Philip Augustus wasn't content with recovering Normandy. He continued his offensive, conquering Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and most of Poitou. By 1206, the Angevin Empire had been reduced to a few holdings in southwestern France and the Channel Islands. The King of England had been transformed from the dominant power in France to a minor player struggling to hold on to his remaining continental possessions. The final test of Philip's achievement came at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, one of the most important battles in European history. John had assembled a massive coalition, including the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, the Count of Flanders, and various German princes, all determined to crush Philip and restore the Angevin Empire. The battle that followed was fought not just for territory, but for the future of medieval Europe. Bouvines was a complete vindication of Philip's long-term strategy. The French army that took the field was not just numerically superior, but qualitatively different from previous royal forces. Philip had systematically professionalized his military, recruiting knights from across his expanded domains, developing new tactical formations, and creating supply systems that could support extended campaigns. When the coalition forces met the French at Bouvines, they faced not just an army, but a war machine. The battle itself was a masterpiece of medieval warfare. Philip personally led charges that broke enemy formations. His household knights fought with disciplined ferocity, and his infantry proved that foot soldiers could stand against mounted knights when properly trained and equipped. The capture of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Count of Flanders, and numerous other enemy leaders was a propaganda victory that resonated across Europe. The domestic consequences of Philip's victories were as important as their international impact. The systematic conquest of Angevin territories dramatically expanded the royal domain, giving the crown direct control over resources that previous kings could only dream of. Normandy alone was richer than the original Capetian territories, while the conquest of the Loire Valley added strategic depth and agricultural wealth. Philip also revolutionized royal administration to manage his expanded kingdom. He developed a new class of royal officials called baillis, who administered justice and collected revenues with unprecedented efficiency. He created systematic records of royal rights and revenues, founding the tradition of bureaucratic government that would characterize the French monarchy for centuries. He granted charters to towns and communes, creating urban allies who supported royal authority against feudal independence. The reign of Philip Augustus also witnessed important cultural developments. The University of Paris reached new heights of intellectual achievement, attracting scholars from across Europe. Gothic architecture flourished under royal patronage, with the construction of new cathedrals that proclaimed the glory of both God and the French monarchy. The Arthurian romances reached their mature form during this period, creating a literary culture that celebrated chivalric ideals while subtly promoting royal authority. When Philip Augustus died in 1223, he left his son Louis VIII a kingdom transformed beyond recognition. The Capetian monarchy was now the dominant power in Western Europe. The royal domain included most of northern and central France, and the institutions of royal government were firmly established. The patient, strategic vision of Philip Augustus had achieved what seemed impossible in 1180, the transformation of France from a collection of feudal principalities into a unified kingdom under royal authority. The consolidation of medieval France, Louis VIII to Philip III, 1223-1285. The death of Philip Augustus in 1223 marked the end of an era, but not the end of Capetian expansion. The 62 years that followed, encompassing the reigns of Louis VIII, Louis XIX, St. Louis, and Philip III, would witness the consolidation of the gains made by Philip Augustus and the emergence of France as not just the dominant military power in Europe, but as the cultural and spiritual center of medieval Christendom. This was the period when France truly became the eldest daughter of the Church, and French civilization reached heights that would influence European culture for centuries. Louis VIII, known as the Lion, ruled for only 3 years, 1223-1226, but his brief reign was packed with decisive action that continued his father's work of expansion and consolidation. Louis inherited a kingdom that was powerful, but not yet secure. The English still held significant territories in southwestern France. Rebellious nobles in the south remained defiant, and the Albigensian heresy in Languedoc posed both a spiritual and political challenge to royal authority. Louis VIII's most significant achievement was the conquest of Languedoc, the sophisticated region of southern France that had developed its own distinct culture, language, and religious practices. The Albigensian Crusade, which had begun in 1209 as a papal campaign against Cathar heretics, had devastated the region but failed to establish stable political control. Louis VIII transformed what had been a religious war into a royal conquest, systematically reducing Cathar strongholds and extending direct royal authority over territories that had never before acknowledged Capetian rule. The siege of Avignon in 1226 demonstrated the new character of royal warfare. Louis VIII brought to bear the full power of medieval siege technology, massive trebuchets, sophisticated undermining techniques, and disciplined professional soldiers who could maintain a siege for months. When Avignon fell after a 3-month siege, it sent a clear message throughout Languedoc. Resistance to royal authority was futile. But Louis VIII's conquest was more than military domination. It was cultural integration. The king brought northern French administrators, clerics, and settlers to the south, beginning the long process of linguistic and cultural assimilation that would eventually make Languedoc an integral part of France. This wasn't simple cultural imperialism, but a complex process of exchange that enriched both northern and southern traditions. When Louis VIII died suddenly in 1226, he left the throne to his 12-year-old son Louis IX, under the regency of his remarkable mother, Blanche of Castile. The regency period, 1226-1234, proved that Capetian institutions had become strong enough to survive a royal minority, but it also demonstrated the crucial role that exceptional individuals could play in medieval politics. Blanche of Castile was one of the most formidable women in medieval history. Intelligent, determined, and politically astute, she faced a coalition of rebellious nobles who thought they could exploit the royal minority to recover their independence. The baronial revolt of 1226-1230 was the last serious attempt by the great feudal houses to roll back Capetian expansion, and Blanche crushed it with a combination of military skill and diplomatic brilliance. Blanche's victory established important precedents for royal authority. She demonstrated that the monarchy could function effectively even without an adult king, that royal justice was supreme throughout the kingdom, and that rebellion against the crown would be met with overwhelming force. Her regency also showed that women could exercise political power effectively, a lesson that would influence French politics for centuries. When Louis IX began his personal rule in 1234, he inherited a kingdom that was militarily supreme and administratively sophisticated, but he would transform it into something unprecedented, a realm that combined temporal power with spiritual authority, making the French monarchy the moral leader of medieval Europe. Louis IX, who would be canonized as Saint Louis in 1297, was the ideal of medieval Christian kingship made flesh. Tall, handsome, and possessed of natural charisma, he combined deep personal piety with shrewd political intelligence. His daily routine included hours of prayer and religious reading, but he was also a master of statecraft who understood that effective rule required more than good intentions. The key to Louis IX's success was his understanding that royal authority ultimately depended on royal justice. He made himself personally accessible to his subjects, holding court under an oak tree at Vincennes, where anyone could bring their grievances directly to the king. This wasn't mere theater. Louis was genuinely committed to the idea that the king was responsible for ensuring justice for all his subjects, regardless of their social status. Louis IX's legal reforms revolutionized medieval jurisprudence. He restricted the right of private warfare among nobles, established royal courts with jurisdiction over major crimes, and created a system of appeals that allowed subjects to challenge local justice. His ordinances on administration, military service, and commercial law created a framework of royal legislation that would evolve into the foundation of French law. The king's reputation for justice extended far beyond France. He served as arbiter in international disputes, with rulers across Europe accepting his judgment in territorial and dynastic conflicts. When Henry III of England and Louis IX signed the Treaty of Paris in 1259, it wasn't just a territorial settlement. It was recognition that the French king had become the moral authority in European politics. But Louis IX's greatest achievement and his greatest failure was his leadership of the Seventh and Eighth Crusades, 1248 to 1254 and 1270. The First Crusade saw Louis lead a massive expedition to Egypt, aiming to strike at the heart of Muslim power in the eastern Mediterranean. The campaign began brilliantly with the capture of Damietta, but ended in disaster when Louis was captured by Muslim forces and had to be ransomed. Rather than ending his crusading career, the disaster in Egypt seemed to strengthen Louis's resolve. He spent 4 years in the Holy Land, strengthening Christian defenses and negotiating with Muslim leaders. His conduct during this period enhanced his reputation for courage and piety, even though he achieved little militarily. The Eighth Crusade in 1270 was Louis IX's final act. At age 56, suffering from illness but driven by religious conviction, he led another expedition to North Africa. He died of dysentery at Tunis, still planning the assault that would restore Christian control over the Holy Land. His death marked the end of the great age of crusading, but it also completed his transformation into a saint and martyr. Philip III, who succeeded his father in 1270, was a competent but unspectacular ruler who consolidated the gains of his predecessors without achieving great innovations. His reign, 1270-1285, was marked by continued administrative development, the integration of newly conquered territories, and the emergence of new challenges from England and Aragon. The most significant development during Philip III's reign was the evolution of royal administration into a true bureaucracy. The expansion of the royal domain had created administrative challenges that required systematic solutions. Philip III developed specialized courts, professional administrators, and regular systems of communication that could manage a kingdom stretching from Flanders to the Pyrenees. By 1285, when Philip III died, France had achieved a position of dominance in medieval Europe that would last for centuries. The Capetian monarchy controlled most of what is now France. Royal justice was supreme throughout the kingdom, and French culture was spreading across Europe through universities, Gothic architecture, and vernacular literature. The foundations had been laid for the next phase of French expansion under Philip IV the Fair, who would push royal power to new heights while creating new conflicts that would test the strength of the institutions his predecessors had built. Philip the Fair and the Crisis of Medieval Monarchy, 1285–1314. Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, was perhaps the most controversial king in the long line of Capetian rulers. Handsome, intelligent, and utterly ruthless, he pushed royal power to heights that his predecessors could never have imagined, but in doing so he created conflicts that would haunt France for generations. His reign, 1285–1314, marked both the pinnacle of medieval royal authority and the beginning of its transformation into something recognizably modern, a centralized state that could mobilize unprecedented resources but also generated unprecedented opposition. Philip inherited a kingdom that was militarily supreme and financially prosperous, but he also inherited problems that would test every aspect of royal power. The expansion of royal authority had created new expenses, professional armies, permanent bureaucracies, and ambitious building projects all required funds on a scale that medieval taxation had never attempted to provide. Traditional feudal revenues were no longer sufficient for a kingdom that aspired to dominate Europe, forcing Philip to develop new forms of taxation that challenged fundamental assumptions about royal rights and noble privileges. The king's solution was characteristically bold and controversial. He would tax everyone, including groups that had traditionally been exempt from royal taxation. Philip imposed taxes on the clergy, demanded forced loans from Italian banking houses, debased the currency to increase royal revenues, and created new taxes on commercial transactions. These measures generated enormous revenues, but they also generated enormous opposition from those who found themselves paying for royal ambitions. The conflict with Pope Boniface VIII, 1294–1303, became the defining struggle of Philip's reign, a clash between two competing visions of authority that would reshape the relationship between church and state throughout Europe. The immediate cause was Philip's taxation of the clergy, which Boniface declared illegal in his bull Clericis Laicos, 1296. But the deeper issue was whether the king or the pope was supreme within the Kingdom of France. Boniface VIII was perhaps the last pope to seriously believe that papal authority was supreme over all earthly rulers. His bull Unam Sanctum, 1302, declared that it is altogether necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. This wasn't mere theological speculation. Boniface meant it literally, and he was prepared to use all the weapons of spiritual warfare to enforce papal supremacy. Philip the Fair was equally determined to assert royal independence. His response to papal claims was to convene the first Estates General in French history, 1302, bringing together representatives of the nobility, clergy, and towns to support royal authority against papal interference. This assembly wasn't a parliament in the English sense. It had no independent power and couldn't limit royal authority. But it was a recognition that even absolute monarchy needed popular support to be effective. The climax of the conflict came in 1303 when Philip's agents, led by Guillaume de Nogaret, actually arrested Pope Boniface VIII at his palace in Anagni. The outrage of Anagni shocked medieval Europe. No one had laid hands on a pope since the time of the barbarian invasions. Though Boniface was quickly released, he died shortly afterward, broken by the humiliation. Philip had demonstrated that royal power, backed by sufficient force and popular support, could overcome even papal authority. The victory over the papacy was followed by an even more dramatic demonstration of royal power, the destruction of the Knights Templar, 1307–1314. The Templars had become the most powerful financial institution in Europe, with vast land holdings, extensive banking networks, and military forces that answered to no temporal authority. They had also become inconvenient creditors to a king who owed them enormous sums and resented their independence. Philip's campaign against the Templars was a masterpiece of political manipulation. On Friday, October 13, 1307, royal agents simultaneously arrested every Templar in France on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual misconduct. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, but Philip had learned from his conflict with Boniface VIII that public opinion mattered. He orchestrated a propaganda campaign that painted the Templars as corrupt enemies of Christianity who deserved their fate. The destruction of the Templars served multiple purposes for Philip. It eliminated his debts to the order, provided vast new revenues through confiscated Templar properties, and demonstrated that no institution, however powerful or prestigious, was immune to royal authority. The fact that Philip could convince other European rulers and even the Pope to suppress the Templars showed that French power and French methods were becoming the standard for European statecraft. Philip's domestic policies were equally revolutionary. He continued the expansion of royal administration, creating new courts, new taxes, and new officials who answered directly to the crown. The Parlement of Paris evolved from a feudal court into a sophisticated judicial institution that could handle complex legal cases and administrative disputes. Royal bailli and seneschaux administered justice throughout the kingdom with unprecedented efficiency and consistency. The king also promoted economic development through policies that would be familiar to modern economists. He encouraged trade by standardizing weights and measures, granted privileges to merchant guilds, and founded new towns in strategic locations. The famous fairs of Champagne reached their peak during his reign, making France the commercial hub of medieval Europe. Italian banking houses, led by the Lombards and Cahorsins, established branches throughout France, creating a sophisticated financial network that could support royal ambitions. But Philip's reign also revealed the tensions inherent in the expansion of royal power. The nobility, who had grudgingly accepted royal supremacy under St. Louis, began to chafe under Philip's more aggressive assertions of authority. The leagues that formed during his reign, associations of nobles who demanded limitations on royal power, prefigured the conflicts that would dominate later medieval politics. The financial innovations that funded Philip's policies also created new problems. Currency debasement led to inflation and economic instability. New taxes generated resistance from those forced to pay them. The destruction of traditional institutions like the Templars created uncertainty about the security of property and privileges. Philip's methods were effective in the short term, but they stored up troubles for his successors. Philip's foreign policy was characterized by the same aggressive ambition that marked his domestic rule. He intervened repeatedly in Flemish affairs, seeking to control the wealthy textile cities that were crucial to European commerce. The Battle of Courtrai, 1302, where Flemish citizen soldiers defeated French knights, was a shocking upset that revealed the limitations of traditional military methods. Philip's armies were still formidable, but they were no longer invincible. The king's expansionist policies also brought him into conflict with England, where Edward I was pursuing his own aggressive agenda in Scotland and Wales. The intermittent warfare between France and England during Philip's reign prefigured the much larger conflicts that would devastate both kingdoms in the following century. When Philip the Fair died in 1314, he left a kingdom that was unprecedented in its power and wealth, but also unprecedented in the tensions and contradictions built into its political system. His three sons would rule in succession: Louis VI, 1314-1316, Philip V, 1316-1322, and Charles IV, 1322-1328, but none would live long enough to resolve the problems their father had created. The death of Charles IV in 1328 without a male heir would trigger the succession crisis that led to the 100 Years' War, as Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother Isabella Philip the Fair's daughter. The institutions and methods that Philip had developed to make France supreme in Europe would be tested in the greatest military conflict of the medieval period, a struggle that would determine whether France would remain united under royal authority or fragment into competing principalities as so many other medieval kingdoms had done. The end of the Capetians and the Valois succession, 1314-1350. The year 1328 marked one of the most fateful turning points in French history. When Charles IV, the last direct Capetian king, died without a male heir, he brought to an end a dynasty that had ruled France for over 3 centuries and created the succession crisis that would plunge France and England into the longest war in medieval history. The transition from the Capetians to their Valois cousins seemed straightforward to contemporary French nobles, but it opened questions about royal legitimacy that would haunt Europe for over a century and transform the nature of medieval warfare forever. The 14 years between Philip the Fair's death in 1314 and the Valois succession in 1328 revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the system Philip had created. His 3 sons, Louis the Gex, the quarrelsome Philip V the Tall, and Charles IV the Fair, were competent rulers who maintained royal authority and continued their father's policies. But they were also cursed by personal tragedies and political crises that would have profound consequences for French history. Louis VI's brief reign, 1314-1316, was dominated by the aftermath of the scandals that had rocked the royal family in the final years of Philip the Fair's rule. The Tour de Nesle affair, in which the wives of Louis and his brothers were accused of adultery with Norman knights, had shattered confidence in the royal succession and raised questions about the legitimacy of potential heirs. When Louis VI died suddenly in 1316, he left only a pregnant wife and a young daughter, creating the first succession crisis since the establishment of Capetian power. The succession of Philip V in 1316 established a crucial precedent that would later be used to exclude Edward III of England from the French throne. Philip became king despite the fact that his brother Louis Auguste had left a daughter, Jeanne of Navarre, who had a better hereditary claim. The decision to crown Philip rather than accept a female successor, or a regency for Louis VI's posthumous son, who died in infancy, was justified by invoking ancient Frankish law, later called the Salic law, which supposedly prohibited inheritance through the female line. Philip V, 1316-1322, proved to be an able administrator who continued the institutional innovations of his predecessors. He standardized weights and measures throughout the kingdom, reformed the currency, and improved the efficiency of royal justice. His reign saw important developments in royal administration, including the creation of the Chambre des Comptes, a specialized court that managed royal finances with unprecedented sophistication. But Philip V also faced the first serious challenges to the expanded royal authority that his family had built. The noble leagues that had formed during his father's reign became more organized and more ambitious, demanding written guarantees of their traditional privileges and limitations on royal taxation. The king was forced to grant charters that seemed to limit royal power, though in practice these concessions were often ignored when political circumstances changed. Charles IV, 1322-1328, was the most successful of Philip the Fair's sons, presiding over a period of relative peace and prosperity that seemed to vindicate Capetian methods of government. He successfully intervened in Gascony, forcing Edward II of England to acknowledge French sovereignty over territories that had been disputed for generations. He reformed royal administration, promoted trade and commerce, and maintained the prestige of French arms through successful military campaigns. But Charles IV's greatest achievement, the recovery of Gascony, also contained the seeds of future disaster. Edward II's humiliation in 1325, when he was forced to pay homage to Charles IV for his French territories, generated resentment in England that would be exploited by future claimants to the French throne. The precedent that English kings must acknowledge French sovereignty over their continental possessions created a constitutional contradiction that could only be resolved through war. When Charles IV died in February 1328, the succession crisis that followed was unprecedented in Capetian history. Charles left no sons, and his wife was pregnant with a child who might be male. The great nobles of France faced a choice between waiting for the birth and accepting a regency if the child was male, or immediately choosing a new king from among Charles's relatives. The leading claimant was Philip of Valois, Charles IV's cousin and the nearest male relative in the direct line. But there was another claimant with a potentially stronger hereditary claim, Edward III of England, whose mother Isabella was Charles IV's sister. If inheritance could pass through the female line, Edward had a better claim than Philip. If it could not, then Philip was the rightful king. The French nobles chose Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI in 1328. Their decision was based on a combination of practical politics and legal precedent. Philip was French, resident in France, and familiar with French customs and French interests. Edward III was English, committed to English interests, and would presumably subordinate French concerns to English advantage. The precedent of Philip V's succession in 1316 suggested that female inheritance was not recognized in France, but the decision also reflected the French nobility's determination to maintain their independence from English influence. The prospect of an English king ruling France seemed like a return to the Angevin Empire that Philip Augustus had worked so hard to destroy. The nobles who chose Philip VI were choosing not just a king, but a guarantee of French independence and French interests. Edward III initially accepted the decision, paying homage to Philip VI for his French territories and acknowledging him as King of France. This submission seemed to settle the succession question permanently. But the homage was a humiliation that English pride would not long endure, and the legal questions raised by the succession remained unresolved. Philip VI's early reign, 1328-1350, seemed to justify the noble's choice. He was an impressive figure, tall, handsome, and possessed of the royal charisma that medieval kingship required. He continued the administrative innovations of his predecessors, promoted economic development, and maintained the military supremacy that had become synonymous with French power. The new king faced his first major test in Flanders, where urban revolts threatened French control over the wealthy textile cities. The Battle of Cassel, 1328, saw Philip VI lead a traditional charge of heavy cavalry that shattered the Flemish militia, demonstrating that French military methods remained effective against conventional opponents. The victory seemed to confirm that the Valois succession had maintained French strength and prestige. Philip VI also presided over important developments in French culture and intellectual life. The University of Paris continued to attract students from across Europe, while French vernacular literature reached new heights of sophistication. The Roman de la Rose, the Arthurian romances, and the emerging tradition of historical chronicles created a literary culture that influenced European thought for centuries. But Philip VI's reign also revealed emerging problems that would soon threaten the entire Valois enterprise. The costs of government continued to rise, forcing the king to rely increasingly on extraordinary taxation that generated noble resistance. The economy showed signs of strain, with bad harvests and commercial disruptions creating social tensions. Most ominously, English attitudes toward the French succession began to harden as Edward III consolidated his power and began to contemplate recovering his rightful inheritance. The crisis that would transform medieval Europe began to emerge in the late 1330s, when disputes over Philip VI's policies in Gascony provided Edward III with a pretext for challenging the Valois succession. In 1337, Philip declared Edward's French fiefs forfeit, and Edward responded by claiming the title of King of France. The diplomatic revolution that followed would ignite the 100 Years' War and test whether the France that the Capuchins had built could survive the greatest military challenge in its history. The death of the last direct Capuchin in 1328 had seemed like a minor dynastic transition, easily managed by experienced French politicians. But it had actually opened a Pandora's box of legal, political, and military conflicts that would reshape European civilization and create the national identities that would define France and England for centuries to come. The 100 Years' War begins, Crécy and the Black Prince, 1337 to 1380. The opening of the Hundred Years' War in 1337 marked the beginning of the greatest test that medieval France would ever face. What started as a dynastic dispute between two royal cousins would evolve into a total war that transformed military technology, reshaped political institutions, and forged the national consciousness of both France and England. The first phase of this epic struggle, from Edward III's assumption of the French title through the devastating English victories at Crécy and Poitiers, would shatter the assumptions that had governed European warfare for centuries and bring the French monarchy to the brink of collapse. Edward III's decision to claim the French throne in 1337 was calculated political theater designed to provide legal justification for what was essentially a war of conquest. The English king had compelling reasons for challenging Philip VI beyond mere dynastic ambition. The French monarchy's interference in English affairs in Scotland, the continued disputes over sovereignty in Gascony, and the lucrative wool trade with Flanders all provided practical motives for war. But by claiming to be the rightful king of France, Edward transformed a territorial dispute into a constitutional crisis that could only be resolved through total victory. The early phases of the war revealed the revolutionary changes that were transforming medieval warfare. The English had learned harsh lessons from their campaigns in Scotland, where traditional heavy cavalry had proven vulnerable to disciplined infantry armed with new weapons and fighting in defensive positions. Edward III and his commanders developed innovative tactics that combined dismounted men-at-arms, longbowmen, and defensive positioning in ways that would revolutionize European battlefields. The Siege of Calais, 1346 to 1347, demonstrated the new character of medieval warfare. Rather than attempting a quick assault, Edward III settled down for a methodical siege that lasted almost a year. This wasn't the chivalric warfare of previous centuries, where knights sought quick glory through dramatic charges. This was modern siege warfare that required professional logistics, sophisticated engineering, and the financial resources to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods. But it was the Battle of Crécy, August 26, 1346, that announced to medieval Europe that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. Philip VI assembled what should have been an overwhelming force, over 20,000 men, including the flower of French chivalry, Italian crossbowmen, and allied forces from across Europe. Facing them was Edward III's smaller but more disciplined army of perhaps 15,000 men, positioned on a hillside that negated the traditional advantage of heavy cavalry. The battle began badly for the French when their Genoese crossbowmen, who had marched through mud and rain, found their bowstrings wet and their weapons ineffective against the English longbows. When the crossbowmen retreated in disorder, Philip VI ordered his cavalry to charge through them, creating chaos in the French ranks before the battle had properly begun. What followed was a systematic destruction of French military power through the devastating effectiveness of English longbows. The Welsh and English archers, protected by dismounted men-at-arms and positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, poured arrows into the charging French cavalry with murderous efficiency. Horses and riders fell in heaps, creating obstacles that disrupted subsequent charges and turned the battlefield into a killing ground. The slaughter at Crécy was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe that shattered the myth of French military supremacy. King John of Bohemia, blind and aged, died leading a charge that epitomized the heroic futility of traditional chivalric warfare. The Count of Alençon, brother to the King of France, fell with his horse shot from under him. Over 1,500 French nobles died while English casualties were minimal. The aftermath of Crécy revealed the strategic implications of the new military technology. Edward III was able to capture Calais after its year-long siege, giving England a permanent foothold on the French coast that would last for over 2 centuries. The prestige of French arms, carefully built over generations of Capetian expansion, lay in ruins. Philip II's authority was called into question not just by English claims, but by his own subjects, who began to doubt whether traditional monarchy could provide effective defense against the new warfare. The disaster at Crécy was compounded by the arrival of the Black Death in 1347, which devastated both kingdoms, but hit France particularly hard. The plague killed perhaps one-third of the French population, disrupting agriculture, commerce, and administration just when the kingdom needed all its resources to resist English invasion. The combination of military defeat and demographic catastrophe created a crisis that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. Philip II's death in 1350 brought his son John II, John the Good, to the throne at the worst possible moment. John inherited a kingdom that was militarily defeated, financially exhausted, and socially disrupted. His reign, 1350–1364, would see France reach the nadir of its medieval fortunes, as English armies ravaged the countryside and French institutions proved inadequate to meet the challenge of total war. John II's character was both his greatest asset and his fatal weakness. He was brave to the point of recklessness, generous to the point of financial irresponsibility, and committed to chivalric ideals that had become dangerously obsolete. His creation of the Order of the Star, intended to rival the English Order of the Garter, exemplified his belief that inspiration and honor could overcome tactical disadvantage and superior logistics. The resumption of major warfare in 1355 brought Edward the Black Prince, Edward III's eldest son, to prominence as one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval period. The Black Prince's raid from Bordeaux to Narbonne in 1355 demonstrated the New English strategy of chevauchée, systematic destruction of enemy territory designed to undermine both the economy and the prestige of French royal power. The chevauchée was psychological warfare as much as military strategy. By burning villages, destroying crops, and capturing towns within sight of major French fortresses, the English demonstrated that French royal power could not protect French subjects. This erosion of royal prestige was as damaging as any military defeat, as it undermined the fundamental compact between king and people that provided legitimacy for medieval monarchy. The climax of John II's disasters came at the Battle of Poitiers, September 19, 1356, where his attempt to corner and destroy the Black Prince's army resulted in an even more devastating defeat than Crécy. John II, determined to restore French military honor, personally led charges against disciplined English positions and was captured along with his youngest son and much of the French nobility. The capture of the King of France was unprecedented in European history. Never before had a reigning monarch been taken prisoner by foreign enemies. The event sent shockwaves across Europe and created a constitutional crisis in France that tested every institution of medieval government. With the king imprisoned in England, effective authority passed to his eldest son, the Dauphin Charles, who found himself ruling a kingdom that seemed to be disintegrating. The Treaty of Bretigny, 1360, which secured John II's release, represented the complete triumph of English arms and English diplomacy. Edward III renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine, the port of Calais, and an enormous ransom of 3 million gold crowns. France was reduced to a truncated rump kingdom, while England controlled the most profitable territories and commanded the seas. Yet even in defeat, the French monarchy showed remarkable resilience. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles V, refused to ratify the treaty's most humiliating provisions and began the patient work of military and administrative reform that would eventually restore French power. The disasters of the early Hundred Years' War had revealed the weaknesses of traditional French institutions, but they had also created the conditions for revolutionary changes that would make France stronger than ever before. France's darkest hour, civil war and foreign occupation, 1380–1420. The death of Charles V in 1380 plunged France into its darkest period since the Viking invasions 5 centuries earlier. What followed was not just military defeat or dynastic crisis, but the near-complete collapse of royal authority and national unity. For 40 years, France would be torn apart by civil war, foreign invasion, and social revolution as competing factions fought for control, while English armies conquered territory and planted their banners in the heart of the kingdom. This was the crucible in which modern France was forged, through suffering so intense that it created a national consciousness strong enough to survive any future challenge. Charles VI, who inherited the throne at age 11 in 1380, began his reign under the regency of his uncles, whose greed and incompetence quickly undid the careful reconstruction that Charles V had achieved. The regents reversed his father's military reforms, squandered the royal treasury on their own ambitions, and reimposed the crushing taxation that Charles V had reduced. Popular fury erupted in revolts across the kingdom: the Maillotins rebellion in Paris, the Tuscan uprising in Languedoc, and rural jacqueries that revealed the depth of social tensions building within French society. But the real catastrophe began in 1392, when Charles VI suffered the first attack of the madness that would plague him for the rest of his 42-year reign. The king's periodic insanity, he sometimes believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, created a power vacuum that was filled by competing noble factions whose rivalry would tear France apart for a generation. The conflict between the Armagnacs and Burgundians was more than a simple power struggle between ambitious nobles. It represented fundamentally different visions of what France should become. The Armagnacs, led by the Count of Armagnac and later by the Dauphin Charles, represented traditional royal authority, centralized government, and resistance to foreign influence. The Burgundians, led by the Duke of Burgundy, favored decentralized rule, accommodation with England, and policies that benefited their own territories at the expense of royal power. The Duke of Burgundy controlled some of the richest territories in Europe, not just the Duchy of Burgundy itself, but Flanders, Artois, and other territories that made him potentially more powerful than the King of France. His alliance with England wasn't just diplomatic convenience, but strategic necessity, as English control of the sea routes was essential for Flemish commerce. The Burgundian program of accommodation with England represented a coherent alternative to traditional French nationalism. The civil war that erupted between these factions was fought with a savagery that shocked even medieval observers. The assassination of Louis of Orléans in 1407, ordered by John the Fearless of Burgundy, opened a cycle of revenge killings that decimated the French nobility. The massacre of Armagnac supporters in Paris in 1418, where mobs dragged officials from their houses and butchered them in the streets, showed that political conflict had degenerated into social revolution. This internal collapse provided Henry V of England with the opportunity he needed to renew English claims to the French throne. Henry V was everything that Charles VI was not: young, energetic, mentally stable, and possessed of the military genius that had been lacking in English leadership since the Black Prince's death. His invasion of France in 1415 was carefully planned to exploit French divisions and achieve the final English victory that had eluded his predecessors. The Battle of Agincourt, October 25, 1415, was both a military masterpiece and a political catastrophe that demonstrated how completely France had lost the military innovations that had once made it supreme in Europe. Henry VI's army of perhaps 8,000 men faced a French force 3 times larger, but the French had learned nothing from their defeats at Crécy and Poitiers 60 years earlier. The French nobility, eager to restore their military reputation, refused to adopt the defensive tactics and new weapons that might have given them victory. Instead, they charged across muddy fields into a killing zone created by English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms. The result was another catastrophic defeat that cost France much of its remaining military leadership and left the kingdom defenseless against systematic English conquest. What made Agincourt different from earlier English victories was Henry V's strategic vision. Rather than seeking quick territorial gains or demanding tribute, Henry aimed at nothing less than the complete conquest of France and the permanent union of the two crowns. His systematic campaign of siege warfare, which captured Caen, Rouen, and dozens of lesser towns, was designed to establish permanent English administration rather than temporary occupation. The fall of Rouen after a 6-month siege in 1419 was particularly traumatic for French morale. Rouen was the capital of Normandy, the city where Joan of Arc would later be burned, and one of the most important commercial centers in northern France. Its surrender after desperate resistance showed that no French fortress could withstand English siege techniques, and its subsequent transformation into an English administrative center demonstrated that Henry V intended permanent conquest rather than temporary occupation. The assassination of John the Fearless of Burgundy at the Bridge of Montereau in 1419, carried out by Armagnac supporters during what was supposed to be a peace conference, completed the collapse of French unity. The murder turned the Burgundians into irreconcilable enemies of the Dauphin Charles and drove them into complete alliance with England. Philip the Good, who succeeded his murdered father as Duke of Burgundy, would spend the next 30 years working for English victory and French defeat. The Treaty of Troyes, 1420, represented the nadir of French fortunes and came closer than any other document in French history to extinguishing France as an independent kingdom. The treaty declared Charles II's son, the Dauphin Charles, illegitimate and disinherited him from the succession. Henry V of England was declared heir to the French throne and would become King of France upon Charles VI's death. To seal the alliance, Henry married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter. The treaty wasn't just a diplomatic document, it was a program for the complete absorption of France into an Anglo-French empire under English leadership. English administrators took control of French territories, English law was introduced alongside French customs, and English settlers were encouraged to establish permanent communities in conquered areas. For the first time since the Angevin Empire, it seemed possible that France might disappear as an independent political entity. The sudden death of Henry V in 1422, just 2 months before the death of Charles VI, created a succession crisis that revealed the fundamental weakness of the English position. Henry VI, who inherited both crowns, was an infant whose regents lacked the military genius and political authority that had made his father's conquests possible. The English position in France, which had seemed unassailable in 1420, began to show cracks that would eventually widen into complete collapse. But in 1422, the English position still seemed overwhelming. They controlled Paris, Normandy, and much of northern France, while their Burgundian allies controlled the east and northeast. The Dauphin Charles, who had proclaimed himself Charles VII after his father's death, controlled only a truncated kingdom south of the Loire River, derisively called the Kingdom of Bourges by his enemies. The English seemed to have achieved the dream that had eluded their kings since William the Conqueror, the permanent union of England and France under a single crown. French resistance appeared hopeless, French institutions had collapsed, and French unity was shattered beyond repair. Yet it was from this seeming hopelessness that the miracle of French recovery would emerge, sparked by a peasant girl from Lorraine who claimed that the Archangel Michael had commanded her to save France. The miracle of Joan of Arc, France Reborn, 1412-1453. In the darkest hour of French history, when the kingdom lay prostrate under foreign occupation and civil war, salvation came from the most unlikely source imaginable. A peasant girl from the village of Domremy, who claimed that saints had commanded her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. Joan of Arc's brief career, lasting less than 2 years from her first appearance at court to her death at the stake, was one of the most extraordinary episodes in European history. A fusion of religious mysticism, military genius, and political inspiration that transformed a defeated kingdom into a conquering nation. Joan was born around 1412 in Domremy, a village on the border between France and the Holy Roman Empire that had remained loyal to the Dauphin, Charles, even as much of northern France submitted to English rule. Her family were prosperous peasants, neither nobility nor serfs, who had suffered from the raids and counter-raids that made frontier life precarious during the 100 Years' War. Joan grew up in a world where political loyalty, religious devotion, and personal survival were inextricably linked. The voices that Joan claimed to hear beginning around 1425, those of St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Catherine, reflected the religious culture of late medieval France, where direct communication between heaven and earth was considered both possible and necessary. What made Joan's visions significant was not their mystical character, which was common enough, but their specific political content. The saints commanded her to save France, drive out the English, and ensure that Charles VII was properly crowned as the legitimate King of France. Joan's arrival at the court of Chinon in February 1429 came at a moment when French resistance seemed about to collapse entirely. The siege of Orléans, which had begun in October 1428, threatened to give the English control of the Loire River and open the way to the complete conquest of the Dauphin's remaining territories. Charles VII's government was bankrupt, his nobles were demoralized, and his own legitimacy was questioned by many of his subjects. The recognition scene at Chinon, where Joan supposedly identified the disguised Dauphin among his courtiers and spoke with him privately about matters that convinced him of her divine mission, has become legendary. Whether the recognition was miraculous or the result of careful coaching by Joan's supporters, its effect was immediate and dramatic. Charles VII, who had been wavering between resistance and surrender, committed himself to Joan's mission with the desperation of a man who had no other hope. Joan's transformation from peasant visionary to military commander required her adoption of an entirely new identity. She cut her hair short, adopted male clothing, and learned to ride a war horse and handle weapons with remarkable speed. More importantly, she developed a public persona that combined martial authority with religious charisma, presenting herself as God's warrior sent to restore Christian France to its rightful place in the divine order. The Relief of Orléans, May 8, 1429, established Joan's reputation as a miracle worker and marked the turning point in the 100 Years' War. The siege had lasted 7 months and had seemed unbreakable, with English forces controlling the approaches to the city and French morale at its lowest ebb. Joan's arrival transformed the psychology of the siege, inspiring the defenders with religious fervor while convincing many English soldiers that they were fighting against God himself. Joan's military contribution to the relief of Orléans was real, but probably secondary to her psychological impact. She understood instinctively that medieval warfare was as much about morale and divine favor as about tactics and logistics. Her presence at the front lines, her dramatic gestures, and her absolute confidence in divine protection inspired French soldiers to fight with desperate courage while unsettling English forces who had been conditioned to expect easy victory over demoralized French armies. The Loire campaign that followed the relief of Orléans saw Joan at the height of her powers as both military commander and political symbol. The rapid capture of Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency demonstrated that English dominance was not inevitable, while the decisive French victory at the Battle of Patay, June 18, 1429, shattered the myth of English tactical superiority that had persisted since Crécy. At Patay, French heavy cavalry caught an English army in the open and inflicted a devastating defeat that reversed the tactical lessons of the previous century. The English lost over 2,000 men while French casualties were minimal, proving that new French tactics and restored French morale could overcome traditional English advantages. The victory opened the road to Reims, and made possible the crown ceremony that would legitimize Charles VII's kingship. The coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral, July 17, 1429, was Joan's greatest political achievement and the moment when her mission was most completely fulfilled. By insisting that the Dauphin be crowned at Reims, with the traditional ceremony and the holy oil supposedly brought by an angel, Joan reasserted the sacred character of French kingship and challenged the legitimacy of the dual monarchy established by the Treaty of Troyes. The ceremony at Reims was brilliant political theater that transformed Charles VII from a questionable claimant hiding south of the Loire into the legitimate King of France, anointed by God and recognized by his people. Joan's presence at the ceremony, holding her banner and representing divine approval of the new reign, created powerful imagery that resonated throughout France and undermined English claims to legitimate authority. But Joan's capture at Compiègne, May 23, 1430, began the tragic final phase of her career and demonstrated the limitations of individual charisma in determining political outcomes. Her trial for heresy and witchcraft at Rouen, 1430-1431, was a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to discredit both Joan personally and the French cause she represented. The English and their collaborators understood that killing Joan as a military prisoner would make her a martyr, but executing her as a condemned heretic would discredit her mission and suggest that Charles VII's kingship was based on diabolic rather than divine intervention. The trial was carefully orchestrated to produce the desired verdict while maintaining the appearance of legitimate legal proceedings. Joan's death at the stake in Rouen, May 30, 1431, was intended to end her influence and demoralize French resistance, but it had precisely the opposite effect. Her courage during the trial, her consistency in maintaining her claims about her divine mission, and her dignified behavior at her execution convinced many observers that she was indeed a saint martyred by her enemies. The rehabilitation trial of 1455-1456, which declared Joan's original trial invalid and her condemnation unjust, was part of Charles VII's broader campaign to legitimize his reign and discredit English claims in France. But Joan's historical significance transcended the immediate political purposes her memory served. She had demonstrated that French resistance was possible, that English victories were not inevitable, and that national consciousness could overcome foreign occupation. The final phase of the 100 Years' War, 1431-1453, saw the systematic implementation of the military and political revolution that Joan had initiated. Charles VII used the breathing space her victories had provided to reform French military organization, rebuild royal finances, and win over former English allies. The creation of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance provided France with the first permanent professional army in European history, while new artillery techniques gave French forces the technological advantages they needed to recapture English-held fortresses. The fall of Bordeaux in 1453, which ended English rule in Aquitaine after 3 centuries, marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War and the triumph of the national monarchy that Joan of Arc had helped to restore. England retained only Calais of all its former French possessions, while France emerged as the strongest and most unified kingdom in Europe. Joan of Arc's legacy was not just military or political, but cultural and spiritual. She had shown that divine intervention was possible in human affairs, that national identity could triumph over feudal loyalty, and that even the humblest individuals could change the course of history if they possessed sufficient faith and courage. The peasant girl, who had claimed to hear the voices of saints, had indeed saved France, not through magic, but through the power of inspired leadership and unshakable conviction. Renaissance France and the Italian Wars, 1453 to 1559. The end of the 100 Years' War in 1453 marked not just the conclusion of a military conflict, but the beginning of France's transformation into a Renaissance power that would dominate European politics for over a century. Under Louis XV, Charles VIII, Louis XV, and Francis I, France evolved from a war-torn medieval kingdom into a centralized monarchy that could challenge the Habsburg Empire for supremacy over Europe. The Italian Wars, 1494–1559, would become the crucible in which Renaissance France forged its identity as a great power, introducing new ideas about art, architecture, and statecraft while testing French military might against the most sophisticated opponents of the age. Louis XV, 1461–1483, known as the Spider King for his web of diplomatic intrigue, inherited a kingdom that was victorious but exhausted. His genius lay in understanding that France's future lay not in further military adventures, but in careful consolidation of royal power and systematic elimination of the great feudal principalities that still challenged royal authority. Louis XV was perhaps the first truly modern king of France, a ruler who preferred negotiation to warfare, bribery to battle, and patient manipulation to dramatic gestures. The key to Louis XV's success was his methodical destruction of the independence of the great nobles who had profited from the chaos of the previous century. The Duke of Burgundy, who had been England's most valuable ally, found himself isolated and under constant pressure from royal diplomacy. When Charles the Bold of Burgundy was killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, Louis XV immediately moved to absorb the duchy into the royal domain, adding one of the richest territories in Europe to the crown's direct control. Louis XV's acquisition of Anjou, Maine, and Provence through inheritance and confiscation completed the territorial unification of France that had been the goal of Capetian policy for 3 centuries. For the first time since Charlemagne, a single ruler controlled virtually all of what we now consider French territory. But Louis XV's achievement went beyond mere territorial expansion. He created the administrative and financial institutions that made centralized government possible on an unprecedented scale. The king revolutionized royal finance by developing new forms of taxation that could support a permanent bureaucracy and professional military. The taille, originally an emergency war tax, became a regular source of royal revenue that funded everything from court expenses to diplomatic missions. Louis XVIII also promoted trade and industry through protective policies that made France economically self-sufficient and reduced dependence on foreign merchants. When Louis XV died in 1483, he left his son Charles VIII a kingdom that was unified, prosperous, and possessed of military resources that no previous French king had ever commanded. But he also left a young king whose character was utterly different from his own. Where Louis XV had been cautious and calculating, Charles VIII was impulsive and romantic, drawn to the glamorous military adventures that his father had carefully avoided. Charles VIII's invasion of Italy in 1494 opened the Italian Wars, a 65-year struggle that would involve every major European power and transform the nature of Renaissance warfare. The immediate cause was Charles's claim to the Kingdom of Naples through his Angevin inheritance. But the deeper motivation was the lure of Italian wealth and the prestige that military conquest could bring to the French monarchy. The French invasion shocked Italian observers with its scale and sophistication. Charles VIII's army of 25,000 men was the largest military force that had operated in Italy since the time of Charlemagne, while French artillery proved devastatingly effective against medieval Italian fortifications. The rapid march from the Alps to Naples, completed in just 5 months, demonstrated that French military organization had achieved unprecedented efficiency. But the conquest of Naples also revealed the limitations of French power. The League of Venice, which united the Italian states with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire against French expansion, showed that other European powers would not tolerate French dominance in Italy. Charles VIII's hasty retreat from Italy in 1495, fighting a running battle against coalition forces, demonstrated that military conquest without diplomatic support was ultimately unsustainable. Louis XIV, 1498 to 1515, resumed the Italian adventure with greater preparation and more limited objectives. His campaigns in Milan and Lombardy were initially successful, exploiting divisions among Italian states and demonstrating the continuing superiority of French military organization. The conquest of Milan made France a major player in Italian politics and brought French nobles into contact with Renaissance culture at its most sophisticated level. The Italian wars under Louis XIII also marked the emergence of new military technologies that would revolutionize European warfare. French artillery, developed from the innovations of the Hundred Years' War, proved capable of reducing even the strongest fortifications in remarkably short time. The siege of Mirandola in 1511, where French cannons breached walls that had been considered impregnable, announced that traditional defensive strategies were obsolete. The Battle of Carignola, 1503, saw Spanish infantry armed with new firearms defeat traditional French cavalry, while the Battle of Garigliano, 1503, resulted in the complete French evacuation from the Kingdom of Naples. These defeats taught French commanders that military superiority required constant adaptation to new technologies and tactics. The accession of Francis I in 1515 brought to the throne a king who embodied the Renaissance ideal of the warrior prince-patron. Tall, athletic, cultured, and charismatic, Francis III was determined to restore French prestige through military victory and cultural achievement. His early victory at the Battle of Marignano, 1515, where French forces recaptured Milan from Swiss mercenaries, seemed to vindicate his aggressive approach and establish him as the leading military commander of his generation. Francis I's rivalry with Charles V, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, transformed the Italian Wars into a Europe-wide struggle for supremacy between the Valois and Habsburg dynasties. Charles V's possessions, Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, much of Germany, and Spanish territories in the New World, potentially surrounded France and threatened to reduce it to a secondary power. Francis I's response was to form alliances with anyone willing to oppose Habsburg power, including the Ottoman Empire, Protestant German princes, and Italian city-states. The disaster at the Battle of Pavia, 1525, where Francis III was captured and most of the French nobility was killed or taken prisoner, marked the nadir of French fortunes in the Italian wars. The League of Cognac, 1526, united France, the Pope, Venice, and England against Charles V, showing that the balance of power in Europe remained fluid. The sack of Rome in 1527 by unpaid imperial troops was an unintended consequence of the Italian wars that shocked all of Europe and demonstrated how military conflict could spiral beyond political control. The spectacle of the Holy City being pillaged by Christian soldiers while the Pope fled for his life showed that the traditional restraints on warfare were breaking down under the pressure of religious and dynastic conflict. Francis I's later campaigns in Italy achieved limited success but established important precedents for French foreign policy. His alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent scandalized Christian Europe, but proved that France was willing to work with any power that could help contain Habsburg expansion. This pragmatic approach to international relations would become a hallmark of French diplomacy for centuries to come. The introduction of Renaissance culture to France was perhaps the most lasting achievement of the Italian wars. Francis I's patronage of Italian artists, architects, and scholars transformed French court culture and established France as a major center of Renaissance art and learning. The construction of chateaux like Chambord and Fontainebleau, with their blend of French Gothic traditions and Italian Renaissance innovations, created a distinctively French Renaissance style that influenced European architecture for generations. The Peace of Cateau Cambrésis, 1559, which ended the Italian Wars, marked France's withdrawal from Italy but also established the kingdom as the dominant power in northern and western Europe. France retained control of Calais, captured from England in 1558, and the three bishoprics, Metz, Toul, and Verdun, which provided strategic footholds in the Holy Roman Empire. More importantly, the treaty recognized France's position as Spain's equal in European politics and established the principle that no single power could dominate the continent. The Italian wars had transformed France from a medieval kingdom into a Renaissance monarchy that combined military power with cultural sophistication. But they had also created new problems: religious divisions, financial exhaustion, and noble factionalism that would soon plunge the kingdom into its most severe internal crisis since the 100 Years' War. The Religious Wars and Henry IV, 1559–1610. The death of Henry II in a jousting accident in 1559 opened the most traumatic period in French history since the English occupation of the 15th century. For 30 years, France would be torn apart by religious civil wars that combined theological disputes with dynastic conflicts, social tensions, and foreign intervention in a toxic mixture that nearly destroyed the kingdom. The Wars of Religion, 1562–1598, tested every institution of French government and society, but they also produced one of the greatest kings in French history, Henry IV, whose conversion, pragmatism, and political genius would restore peace, prosperity, and royal authority to a kingdom that had seemed beyond salvation. The Protestant Reformation, which began in Germany in 1517, reached France during the 1520s and 1530s, but it took on distinctly French characteristics that reflected the kingdom's unique political and social structure. French Protestantism, influenced by John Calvin's theology and organization, attracted support from nobles seeking greater independence from royal authority, townspeople drawn to reformed religious practices, and scholars fascinated by humanist theology. By 1560, perhaps 10% of the French population had converted to Protestantism, but this minority was concentrated among the politically and economically influential classes. The regency of Catherine de' Medici, 1560–1574, who governed for her young sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, revealed the fundamental weakness of royal authority when religious unity was shattered. Catherine was a brilliant politician who understood that religious division threatened not just social peace, but royal supremacy, since both Catholics and Protestants claimed divine sanction for their political programs. Her attempt to maintain royal neutrality and find a middle way between competing religious factions was probably the only policy that could have preserved the monarchy, but it satisfied neither side and made her a target for both Catholic and Protestant propaganda. The Massacre of Vassy, 1562, where the Duke of Guise's retainers killed Protestant worshippers in a barn, marked the beginning of open religious warfare and established the pattern of atrocities that would characterize the conflicts. The massacre wasn't planned as a major political event. It grew out of a local dispute over religious practice, but it symbolized the impossibility of peaceful coexistence between competing religious communities. The first phase of the Religious Wars, 1562–1570, saw France divide into three major factions: the Catholic League led by the House of Guise, the Protestant Huguenots led by the House of Bourbon, and the Politiques led by the royal family, who sought to preserve royal authority by transcending religious divisions. Each faction had foreign allies. The Catholics received support from Spain and the Pope, the Protestants from England and German Protestant princes, while the Politiques tried to maintain French independence by playing foreign powers against each other. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, August 24, 1572, was the most traumatic event of the Religious Wars and one of the most shocking episodes in European history. What began as a targeted assassination of Protestant leaders gathered in Paris for the wedding of Henry of Navarre became a general massacre that killed thousands of Protestants across France. The massacre was probably ordered by Catherine de' Medici and Charles IX as a desperate attempt to eliminate Protestant political leadership, but it spiraled beyond royal control and became a popular explosion of religious hatred. The international reaction to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre showed how French internal conflicts had become European concerns. Protestant powers like England and the Dutch Republic saw the massacre as evidence of a Catholic conspiracy against all Protestant Christians, while Catholic powers like Spain and the papacy celebrated it as divine justice against heretics. France found itself isolated diplomatically and divided internally as never before. The final phase of the religious wars began with the death of the Duke of Anjou in 1584, which made the Protestant Henry of Navarre heir to the throne. The prospect of a Protestant king was intolerable to the Catholic League, which formed an alliance with Philip II of Spain to prevent Henry's succession. The War of the Three Henrys, 1585-1589, was fought between Henry III, the king, Henry of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir. The assassination of Henry of Guise and his brother the Cardinal of Guise at the Chateau of Blois in 1588, ordered by Henry III, was a desperate attempt to break Catholic League power, but instead triggered a Catholic revolt that drove the king from Paris. Henry III's alliance with Henry of Navarre, which united the crown with the Protestant cause, seemed to offer hope for royal victory, but Henry III's assassination by a fanatical monk in 1589 left Henry of Navarre as the sole claimant to the throne. Henry IV's early reign, 1589-1598, was a masterpiece of political and military strategy that demonstrated how effective leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. As a Protestant king claiming a Catholic throne in a kingdom where Catholics outnumbered Protestants 9-1, Henry faced challenges that would have defeated a lesser ruler. His solution was to combine military pressure with political flexibility in ways that gradually isolated his enemies and won over former opponents. The Siege of Paris, 1590, showed both Henry IV's military skill and his political wisdom. Rather than attempting to starve the city into submission, which would have created lasting resentment, Henry allowed food supplies to reach the civilian population while maintaining pressure on the Spanish garrison and Catholic League leadership. This combination of firmness and mercy demonstrated that Henry understood the difference between defeating enemies and governing subjects. Henry IV's conversion to Catholicism in 1593 was the crucial decision that ended the religious wars and restored royal authority. His famous comment that Paris is worth a mass may be apocryphal, but it captured the essence of his approach to kingship: practical, pragmatic, and focused on results rather than ideology. The conversion removed the religious objection to his rule, while his Protestant past convinced many Catholics that he would not persecute religious minorities. The Edict of Nantes, 1598, was Henry IV's masterpiece of religious diplomacy, a document that established principles of religious tolerance that were generations ahead of European practice. The edict granted Protestants freedom of worship in designated areas, civil equality with Catholics, control of certain fortified towns for their security, and access to royal offices and universities. It wasn't complete religious freedom by modern standards, but it was unprecedented religious tolerance by 16th century standards. Henry IV's domestic policies demonstrated his understanding that royal authority ultimately depended on popular prosperity and contentment. His finance minister, the Duke of Sully, reduced taxes, encouraged agriculture and commerce, and eliminated the crushing debt that had accumulated during the religious wars. The king's declaration that he wanted every peasant to have a chicken in the pot on Sundays became a symbol of royal concern for popular welfare. The transformation of Paris under Henry IV showed how effective government could restore confidence and prosperity after decades of warfare and destruction. The construction of the Place Royale, now Place des Vosges, the expansion of the Louvre, and the building of new bridges and markets created employment while demonstrating royal commitment to urban improvement. Paris evolved from a war-torn city into the most beautiful capital in Europe. Henry IV's foreign policy balanced French interests against the continuing threat of Habsburg power while avoiding the costly military adventures that had bankrupted his predecessors. His support for the Dutch revolt against Spain, his intervention in the succession dispute in Claves Ulick, and his alliance with German Protestant princes all served to contain Spanish power without provoking general European war. The assassination of Henry IV by François Ravaillac in 1610 was a national tragedy that demonstrated how much the kingdom had come to depend on the king's personal leadership and charisma. Ravaillac was a Catholic fanatic who believed that Henry's tolerance of Protestantism made him a heretic deserving death, but his act removed the one leader who had proven capable of maintaining religious peace in France. Henry IV's legacy was profound and lasting. He had demonstrated that religious tolerance was compatible with political stability, that royal authority could transcend religious divisions, and that effective government could restore prosperity after devastating civil war. His reign established principles of pragmatic statecraft that would influence French politics for centuries, while his personal charisma made him one of the most beloved kings in French history. The regency that followed Henry IV's death would face new challenges as religious tensions remained unresolved and noble ambitions were reviving, but the foundations that Henry IV had laid would prove strong enough to support the eventual triumph of absolute monarchy under Louis XIV. The religious wars had nearly destroyed France, but they had also created the conditions for the emergence of the most powerful monarchy in European history. Louis XIV and the Age of Absolute Monarchy, 1610–1715. The death of Henry IV in 1610 brought to the throne a 9-year-old boy who would grow up to become the most powerful monarch in European history. Louis XIV's reign of 72 years was not just the longest in French history. It was a transformation of monarchy itself from a feudal institution into an absolute state that served as the model for royal government across Europe. The Sun King, as he came to be known, created a system of centralized authority so complete that he could credibly claim, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state," while building a palace at Versailles that became the eighth wonder of the world and the symbol of royal magnificence for centuries to come. The regency of Marie de Medici, 1610–1617, and the early years of Louis XV's personal rule revealed the continuing fragility of royal authority despite Henry IV's achievements. The great nobles, who had been subdued during the religious wars, quickly resumed their traditional opposition to centralized government, while Protestant fortified cities in the south maintained virtual independence from royal control. The assassination of Henry IV had demonstrated that effective monarchy still depended dangerously on individual royal leadership rather than institutional strength. The emergence of Cardinal Richelieu as Louis XV's chief minister in 1624 marked the beginning of the systematic construction of absolute monarchy that would reach its culmination under Louis XIV. Richelieu was a political genius who understood that royal authority could only be made secure through the methodical destruction of all competing centers of power within the kingdom. His program was elegantly simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. Reduce the great nobles to obedience, eliminate Protestant political independence, and establish French dominance in European affairs. Richelieu's domestic policies were designed to concentrate all effective power in royal hands while maintaining the appearance of traditional institutions. The great nobles were excluded from real political influence, but compensated with court positions and pensions that made them dependent on royal favor. Provincial governors were replaced by intendants, royal officials who answered directly to the crown and could be dismissed at royal pleasure. The parlements and other traditional courts retained their ceremonial functions, but lost their ability to obstruct royal policy. The Siege of La Rochelle, 1627–1628, demonstrated Richelieu's determination to eliminate all forms of political independence within the kingdom. La Rochelle was the most important Protestant stronghold in France, with its own fleet, its own fortifications, and treaties with foreign Protestant powers. Richelieu's systematic siege, which included the construction of a massive seawall to prevent English relief expeditions, showed that no city could resist royal power when the crown was determined to assert its authority. The fall of La Rochelle was followed by the Grace of Alais, 1629, which eliminated Protestant political privileges while confirming their religious rights. This policy of destroying Protestant political independence while preserving Protestant religious practice became a model for royal policy toward all autonomous institutions. The crown would tolerate diversity in private matters, but not in public authority. Richelieu's foreign policy was based on the principle that French security required the systematic weakening of Habsburg power. His support for Protestant German princes during the 30 Years' War scandalized Catholic opinion, but served French interests by preventing Habsburg domination of Germany. The cardinal's famous declaration that, in matters of state, the salvation of kingdoms depends upon policies which are often different from the maxims of private morality, established the principle that state interests transcended religious or moral considerations. When Louis XIV began his personal rule in 1661 after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, he inherited a kingdom that was militarily supreme and administratively centralized. But he would transform it into something unprecedented in European history, a state where royal will was the only source of legitimate authority and royal pleasure, the only limit on governmental action. Louis XIV's construction of Versailles was far more than an architectural project. It was a political strategy designed to transform the French nobility from independent feudal lords into dependent courtiers. By requiring the great nobles to attend court at Versailles, Louis XIV removed them from their provincial power bases while surrounding them with an elaborate court culture that made royal favor essential for social status and economic survival. The etiquette of Versailles was simultaneously magnificent and humiliating for the great nobles, who found themselves competing for the privilege of helping the king dress or attending his lever. What seemed like meaningless ceremony was actually political control of the most sophisticated kind. Nobles who were focused on court precedence and royal favor had neither time nor energy for political opposition. The palace itself was designed to overwhelm visitors with its scale and magnificence. The Hall of Mirrors, with its 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting light from the gardens, created an effect of infinite space. The royal apartments, the chapel, and the gardens all reinforced the same message. Royal power was sublime, eternal, and divinely sanctioned. Louis XIV's religious policies demonstrated both the power and limitations of absolute monarchy. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes, 1685, was intended to complete the religious unification of France that had been the goal of royal policy since the religious wars. The king genuinely believed that religious unity was essential for political stability, and that Protestant persistence represented a challenge to royal authority that could not be tolerated. The immediate consequences of the revocation seemed to vindicate Louis XIV's policy. Most French Protestants converted to Catholicism, at least nominally, while those who refused to convert were forced to emigrate or practice their religion in secret. The kingdom appeared to have achieved the religious unity that had eluded French monarchs for over a century. But the long-term consequences of the revocation were catastrophic for French interests. The emigration of over 200,000 Protestants, many of them skilled artisans and merchants, deprived France of valuable human resources while strengthening its enemies. Protestant refugees brought their skills and their hatred of Louis XIV to England, the Dutch Republic, and Protestant German states, creating a network of French enemies who understood French weaknesses from personal experience. Louis XIV's military policies made France the dominant land power in Europe, but also created the coalitions that would ultimately limit French expansion. The French army under ministers like Louvois became the most professional and effective military force in Europe, with standardized uniforms, regular pay, professional training, and advanced artillery that could reduce any fortress in reasonable time. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1688-1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, tested Louis XIV's military machine against coalitions that included most of the major European powers. These conflicts demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the absolute monarchy that Louis XIV had created. French forces could be mobilized and deployed with unprecedented efficiency, but the costs of constant warfare eventually exhausted even the royal treasury. The battles of Blenheim, 1704, Ramillies, 1706, and Oudenarde, 1708, showed that French military supremacy was no longer automatic. The Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy proved that talented commanders using innovative tactics could defeat even the best French armies. The Siege of Turin, 1706, and the Defense of Vienna, 1683, demonstrated that other European powers had learned French methods and could use them effectively against France itself. The domestic consequences of Louis XIV's wars were severe and lasting. The constant demand for new taxes to fund military campaigns led to popular revolts like the Camisard uprising in the Cévennes and the revolt of the Nupides in Normandy. The sale of royal offices to raise revenue created a bureaucratic class that was independent of royal control, while the increasing burden of royal debt mortgaged the future to pay for present military adventures. Louis XIV's cultural policies made France the arbiter of European taste and established French as the international language of diplomacy and culture. The patronage of writers like Molière, Racine, and Corneille created a classical French literature that became the standard for European drama and poetry. The Academy of Sciences, the Academy of Architecture, and other royal academies made Paris the center of European intellectual life. The creation of the Gobelins factory, the Savonnerie carpet works, and other royal manufactures demonstrated how absolute monarchy could mobilize artistic resources on an unprecedented scale. These institutions produced furnishings and decorative arts that set standards of luxury and refinement that were imitated throughout Europe, while providing employment for hundreds of skilled craftsmen. When Louis XIV died in 1715, after the longest reign in European history, he left a kingdom that was culturally supreme but financially exhausted and militarily overextended. His great-grandson and successor, Louis XV, inherited problems that absolute monarchy had created but could not solve: crushing debt, noble resentment, popular discontent, and international isolation. The system that Louis XIV had built would survive for another 75 years, but it would face challenges that would ultimately prove beyond its capacity to manage. The legacy of Louis XIV was profoundly ambiguous. He had made France the greatest power in Europe and French culture the standard for European civilization, but he had also created a system of government that was too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances and too expensive to sustain indefinitely. The absolute monarchy he perfected would serve as a model for rulers across Europe, but it would also generate the tensions and contradictions that would eventually lead to revolution and the destruction of the old regime entirely. The Enlightenment and Crisis of the Old Regime, 1715 to 1789. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 marked not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a crisis that would ultimately destroy the old regime and transform France forever. The 74 years between the Sun King's death and the outbreak of revolution in 1789 witnessed the emergence of new ideas about government, society, and human rights that fundamentally challenged the assumptions upon which absolute monarchy was based. This was the age of the Enlightenment, when French philosophers and writers created the intellectual framework for modern democracy, while the monarchy they criticized struggled with financial, social, and political problems that seemed to have no solution within the existing system. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans, 1715-1723, provided the first indication that the absolute monarchy Louis XIV had created was entering a period of crisis. The regent's decision to restore political influence to the parlements, which Louis XIV had reduced to ceremonial functions, opened the way for judicial opposition to royal policy that would plague the monarchy for the rest of its existence. The financial experiments of John Law, which created the first major speculative bubble in European history, demonstrated both the need for financial innovation and the dangers of uncontrolled economic experimentation. Law's system, as it came to be known, was a brilliant attempt to solve the monarchy's chronic financial problems through the creation of paper money backed by colonial development in Louisiana. The Mississippi Company that Law created generated enormous paper profits that temporarily made Paris the financial capital of Europe. But the collapse of the scheme in 1720 ruined thousands of investors and created lasting suspicion of financial innovation. The failure of Law's system showed that the monarchy's financial problems were too severe to be solved through clever expedients. Louis XV's personal rule, 1723-1774, coincided with the golden age of the French Enlightenment, when writers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau created new ways of thinking about politics, religion, and society that would eventually provide the intellectual foundation for revolution. The king himself was intelligent and well-educated, but he lacked the force of personality and clear sense of purpose that absolute monarchy required to function effectively. The emergence of Madame de Pompadour as Louis XV's official mistress, 1745-1764, symbolized the growing influence of salon culture and enlightened opinion on royal policy. Pompadour was not just a royal favorite, but an intelligent patron of arts and letters who promoted the careers of philosophers and artists while influencing royal policy in directions that reflected enlightened values. Her support for the Encyclopédie and her patronage of Voltaire demonstrated how enlightened ideas were penetrating even the highest levels of the old regime. The 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, was a global conflict that tested the resources of the old regime to their limits while demonstrating the growing importance of colonial and commercial considerations in European politics. France's alliance with Austria, which reversed centuries of Habsburg-Valois rivalry, was a diplomatic revolution that reflected changing strategic realities but confused traditional French foreign policy. The loss of Canada and Louisiana to Britain in the Treaty of Paris, 1763, was a catastrophic blow to French prestige and a demonstration that the monarchy could no longer compete effectively with more efficient forms of government. The British victory was not just military but systemic. Britain's parliamentary government and commercial economy had proven more effective at mobilizing resources for global warfare than France's absolute monarchy and agricultural economy. The financial crisis that followed the 7 Years' War created the immediate conditions for the revolution that would destroy the old regime. The war had cost over 1 billion livres, nearly doubling the royal debt and creating annual interest payments that consumed over half of royal revenues. Traditional expedients, selling offices, borrowing against future tax revenues, debasing the currency, had been exhausted, leaving the monarchy with no choice but to seek new sources of revenue. The attempts of successive finance ministers, Silhouette, Terray, Turgot, Necker, and Calonne, to solve the financial crisis revealed the fundamental contradictions built into the old regime. The monarchy needed to increase taxes significantly, but the privileged orders, nobility and clergy, who controlled most of the kingdom's wealth, were legally exempt from most taxation. Attempts to tax the privileged orders provoked fierce resistance from the parliaments and the assembly of the clergy, who claimed that fundamental privileges could not be altered without consent from the Estates General. The intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment provided both criticism of existing institutions and alternatives that seemed more rational and effective. Voltaire's attacks on religious intolerance, Montesquieu's analysis of the separation of powers, and Rousseau's theories of popular sovereignty created a new political vocabulary that made the arbitrary authority of absolute monarchy seem both illegitimate and unnecessary. The publication of the Encyclopédie, 1751-1772, edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, represented the culmination of Enlightenment attempts to systematize human knowledge and promote rational approaches to social problems. The Encyclopédie's articles on government, law, and economics provided detailed critiques of existing institutions while proposing reforms based on reason and natural law. Despite government censorship and church opposition, the Encyclopédie circulated widely among educated French people, creating a new way of thinking about politics and society. The economic theories of the physiocrats, led by François Quesnay, challenged the mercantilist assumptions that had guided royal economic policy since Colbert. The physiocratic principle that laissez-faire, laissez-passer should govern economic relationships contradicted the detailed regulation and government intervention that characterized the old regime. Their argument that free trade and minimal government intervention would increase national wealth provided intellectual justification for reducing royal authority over economic matters. The cultural transformation of the 18th century created new forms of sociability that challenged traditional hierarchies while spreading enlightened ideas throughout French society. The growth of coffeehouse culture, the expansion of newspaper and pamphlet literature, and the emergence of public opinion as a political force all contributed to the creation of what historians call the public sphere, a space for rational discussion of political issues that existed independently of official institutions. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, provided both inspiration and practical demonstration that enlightened principles could be implemented successfully. French participation in the American War was motivated primarily by desire for revenge against Britain, but the ideological implications were profound and lasting. French officers like Lafayette returned from America convinced that liberty and equality were not just philosophical abstractions, but practical possibilities. The financial cost of the American War completed the monarchy's slide toward bankruptcy while demonstrating that parliamentary government could mobilize resources more effectively than absolute monarchy. The contrast between American success in creating new institutions and French failure to reform existing ones became increasingly obvious to educated French observers. The Assembly of Notables, 1787, convened by Cologne to approve new taxes on the privileged orders, revealed the complete breakdown of consensus within the old regime. The notables' refusal to approve Cologne's reforms without fundamental changes in the system of government made it clear that incremental reform was no longer possible. The choice had become either revolutionary change or complete collapse. The recall of Necker and the decision to convene the Estates General in 1789 represented the monarchy as admission that it could no longer govern without consent from the nation. Louis XVI's reluctant agreement to double the representation of the Third Estate and allow voting by head rather than by order opened the way for the Third Estate to claim authority to speak for the entire nation. The pamphlet literature that flourished during the pre-revolutionary period of 1788 to 1789 showed how completely enlightened ideas had penetrated French political consciousness. Sieyes's "What is the Third Estate?" provided the theoretical framework for claims that the Third Estate was the true nation, while the privileged orders were parasitic relics of an obsolete feudal past. By 1789, the old regime had lost not just the financial resources to govern effectively, but the intellectual legitimacy that made absolute monarchy acceptable to educated French people. The enlightened criticism of traditional institutions had created expectations for rational government based on consent that absolute monarchy could not satisfy. The stage was set for a revolution that would not just change the government of France, but create new principles of political legitimacy that would eventually transform the entire world. The French Revolution begins, from Reform to Republic, 1789 to 1792. The year 1789 opened with France facing the worst financial crisis in its history, but few contemporaries imagined that within 3 years the thousand-year-old monarchy would be abolished. The king would be a prisoner, and France would be fighting all of Europe to defend a revolution that proclaimed the rights of man and the sovereignty of the people. The French Revolution began as an attempt to reform an outdated financial system and evolved into the most radical political transformation in human history, creating new concepts of citizenship equality and popular government that would reshape not just France, but the entire world. The convening of the Estates General on May 5, 1789, was intended by Louis XVI and his ministers to be a traditional consultation that would approve new taxes and restore the monarchy's financial stability. The elaborate ceremonial that accompanied the opening, with the three estates dressed in their traditional costumes and seated according to ancient protocol, seemed to confirm that this would be a conventional assembly operating within established constitutional frameworks. But the political dynamic unleashed by the election campaign and the drafting of the cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances, had already transformed the character of French politics. The cahiers revealed that discontent with the old regime extended far beyond financial issues to encompass fundamental questions about privilege, representation, and the nature of legitimate government. The Third Estate's cahiers, in particular, demanded not just fiscal reform, but constitutional transformation that would limit royal authority and establish legal equality. The transformation of the Estates General into the National Assembly on June 17, 1789, marked the decisive break with the old regime and the beginning of revolutionary politics in France. When the Third Estate declared itself the representative of the nation and invited the other orders to join it in creating a new constitution, it was asserting a principle of popular sovereignty that fundamentally contradicted the theory of divine right monarchy. The tennis court oath of June 20, 1789, crystallized the revolutionary commitment to constitutional transformation while demonstrating the power of theatrical gesture in revolutionary politics. The deputies' solemn pledge not to separate until France had a new constitution created an image of national unity and determination that captured the imagination of people throughout France and Europe. Louis XV. His attempt to reassert royal authority through the Séance Royale of June 23 demonstrated how completely the political initiative had passed to the revolutionaries. The king's offer of limited reforms and his order that the estates deliberate separately were rejected by deputies who had already committed themselves to more fundamental change. Mirabeau's defiant response, "We are here by the will of the people and will only leave at the point of bayonets," announced that the age of absolute monarchy was ending. The fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, transformed a Parisian riot into the founding myth of the French Revolution and demonstrated the crucial role that popular violence would play in revolutionary politics. The fortress itself was strategically insignificant and held only 7 prisoners, but its capture by armed Parisians became the symbol of popular triumph over tyranny and royal despotism. The great fear that swept rural France in late July and early August showed how revolutionary politics had unleashed social forces that no one could completely control. Peasant attacks on chateaux and burning of feudal documents represented a rural revolution that was parallel to but independent of the political revolution occurring in Versailles and Paris. The August 4th decree abolishing feudalism was a revolutionary moment that transformed French society as completely as the political revolution was transforming French government. The voluntary renunciation of feudal privileges by noble deputies was partly a response to rural violence, but it also represented a genuine commitment to the principle of legal equality that was at the heart of revolutionary ideology. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, was perhaps the most influential political document of the modern era. Its assertion that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, and that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, provided a universal statement of democratic principles that would inspire revolutionary movements around the world for centuries to come. The October days of 1789, when Parisian women marched to Versailles and forced the royal family to return to Paris, demonstrated both the power of popular intervention in revolutionary politics and the gendered character of political action during the revolution. The Women's March was motivated by practical concerns about bread prices, but it had profound political consequences in bringing the king under direct popular pressure. The establishment of the constitutional monarchy, 1789-1792, represented an attempt to combine revolutionary principles with traditional institutions in a system that would satisfy both popular demands for change and elite desires for stability. The Constitution of 1791 created a limited monarchy with separation of powers, legal equality, and protection for individual rights, while maintaining property requirements for voting that excluded most of the population from political participation. The nationalization of church property in November 1789 and the passage of the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790 brought the revolution into direct conflict with the Catholic Church and created the religious division that would plague French politics for over a century. The attempt to create a national church under state control reflected revolutionary commitment to rational reorganization of all institutions, but it also alienated many French people who saw it as an attack on fundamental religious values. The Festival of Federation on July 14, 1790, represented the high point of revolutionary unity and optimism. The elaborate celebration, which brought together representatives from all parts of France to celebrate the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, created powerful imagery of national brotherhood and constitutional harmony that seemed to promise a successful conclusion to the revolutionary transformation. But beneath the surface unity of 1790, fundamental disagreements about the direction and limits of the revolution were already emerging. The distinction between active and passive citizens reflected liberal fears about universal suffrage, while popular demands for economic regulation contradicted liberal commitment to free market economics. The emigration of noble opponents of the revolution and the beginning of counter-revolutionary activity showed that not all French people accepted the legitimacy of revolutionary change. The king's attempted flight to Varennes in June 1791 destroyed the fiction that Louis XVI was a willing partner in constitutional transformation and raised questions about the compatibility of monarchy with revolutionary principles. The discovery that the king had been secretly negotiating with foreign powers while publicly supporting the revolution convinced many revolutionaries that constitutional monarchy was impossible and that more radical solutions were necessary. The declaration of war against Austria in April 1792 marked the beginning of the revolutionary wars that would dominate European politics for the next quarter century. The war was supported by revolutionaries who believed it would expose enemies of the revolution and by the king and queen, who hoped military defeat would lead to the restoration of the old regime. The military disasters of the spring and summer of 1792 created a crisis atmosphere that radicalized revolutionary politics and made possible the overthrow of the monarchy. The Brunswick Manifesto, which threatened Paris with destruction if the royal family were harmed, convinced many Parisians that they were fighting for their lives against a coalition of domestic and foreign enemies. The insurrection of August 10, 1792, which stormed the Tuileries Palace and suspended the king, marked the end of the constitutional monarchy and the beginning of the radical phase of the revolution. The overthrow of the monarchy was accomplished not by the constitutional authorities, but by popular insurrection organized by the radical sections of Paris, demonstrating that the revolution was moving beyond the control of its original liberal leadership. The September massacres of 1792, when Parisian crowds killed over 1,000 prisoners suspected of counter-revolutionary activity, showed how the combination of war, economic crisis, and political polarization was creating an atmosphere of paranoia and violence that would characterize the Terror. The massacres were both a symptom of revolutionary crisis and a precedent for the systematic use of violence as a political weapon. The establishment of the First French Republic on September 22, 1792, completed the destruction of the old regime and opened a new chapter in human history. For the first time since antiquity, a major European power had abolished monarchy and proclaimed popular sovereignty as the basis of legitimate government. The revolution that had begun as an attempt to reform royal finances had become a complete transformation of political and social relationships that would serve as a model and inspiration for democratic movements around the world. The Terror and the Republic of Virtue, 1792-1794. The establishment of the First French Republic in September 1792 opened the most radical and controversial phase of the French Revolution. What began as an experiment in democratic government quickly evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a regime that sought to transform not just political institutions but human nature itself through the systematic use of revolutionary violence. The Terror, as this period came to be known, would see the execution of the king and queen, the attempted destruction of Christianity, and the rise of Maximilien Robespierre as the embodiment of revolutionary virtue and the architect of what he called the Republic of Virtue. The trial and execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 marked a point of no return for the revolution and shocked the monarchical governments of Europe into implacable opposition. The king's trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a symbolic destruction of the principle of divine right monarchy and a declaration that no person was above the law of the people. When the guillotine fell on January 21, 1793, it severed not just a royal head, but the mystical bond between ruler and ruled that had legitimized monarchy for over 1,000 years. The execution divided the revolutionaries themselves, revealing fundamental disagreements about the direction and methods of the revolution. The Girondins, who represented the moderate wing of revolutionary politics, had opposed the king's execution as politically dangerous and morally unnecessary. They favored a decentralized republic that would respect property rights and maintain order while implementing revolutionary principles gradually. Their vision of revolution was essentially liberal: limited government, individual rights, and rule by the educated and propertied classes. The Montagnards, led by Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, represented a more radical vision that saw the revolution as a complete transformation of society, requiring the active participation of the common people and the destruction of all remnants of the old order. They believed that half measures would lead to counter-revolution, and that only through decisive action could the revolution achieve its goals of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all citizens. The outbreak of war with the First Coalition in 1793 created the crisis atmosphere that allowed the Montagnards to seize power and implement their radical program. France found itself fighting Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and several smaller powers while dealing with massive internal rebellions in the Vendée, Lyon, and Toulon. The military situation was desperate. Foreign armies were approaching Paris while internal enemies seemed ready to destroy the Republic from within. The creation of the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793 concentrated executive power in the hands of 12 men who were authorized to take any measures necessary to save the Republic. Under Robespierre's leadership, the committee developed into a revolutionary dictatorship that claimed unlimited authority to defend the revolution against its enemies. This concentration of power was justified by the doctrine of public safety, the idea that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, defined counter-revolutionary activity so broadly that virtually anyone could be arrested and executed for opposing the revolution. The law authorized the arrest of anyone who, by their conduct, their contacts, their words, or their writings, showed themselves to be supporters of tyranny or enemies of liberty. This vague language made it possible to eliminate political opponents while claiming to defend revolutionary principles. The de-Christianization campaign that began in late 1793 represented the most radical attempt in European history to destroy an entire religious culture and replace it with a new civic religion based on reason and revolutionary virtue. Churches were closed, priests were forced to marry or face persecution, and Christian festivals were replaced with celebrations of revolutionary events. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was converted into a temple of reason, where actresses performed ceremonies celebrating the triumph of enlightenment over superstition. Robespierre's emergence as the dominant figure in the Terror reflected his unique combination of personal incorruptibility, ideological purity, and political ruthlessness. Known as the Incorruptible, for his austere lifestyle and refusal to profit personally from his political position, Robespierre embodied the revolutionary ideal of virtue triumphant over corruption. His speeches to the convention were masterpieces of revolutionary rhetoric that combined moral absolutes with political pragmatism in ways that justified the most extreme measures. The Festival of the Supreme Being in June 1794, organized by Robespierre to replace the atheistic cult of reason with a more spiritual revolutionary religion, demonstrated both the scope of revolutionary ambition and the growing megalomania of its leader. Robespierre's role as high priest of the new religion, leading the ceremony while dressed in sky-blue robes, convinced many observers that he was becoming a new kind of tyrant who threatened republican government itself. The Great Terror of the summer of 1794 saw the Revolutionary Tribunal executing over 1,300 people in Paris alone during the months of June and July. The Law of 22. Prairial eliminated most legal protections for the accused and made death virtually the only punishment available to revolutionary courts. The acceleration of executions created an atmosphere of fear that extended even to members of the convention, who began to wonder if they themselves might become victims of the revolutionary justice they had created. The economic policies of the Terror reflected the radical democratic ideology of the Montagnards, who believed that the revolution must serve the interests of the common people rather than just the educated bourgeoisie. The maximum, which set price controls on bread and other essentials, represented an unprecedented intervention in the free market designed to ensure that working people could afford basic necessities. The law of Ventose promised to redistribute the property of convicted counter-revolutionaries to poor patriots, implementing a primitive form of socialism. The military successes of the revolutionary armies during the Terror demonstrated the power of popular mobilization and ideological commitment in warfare. The levée en masse of August 1793 created the first modern conscript army, mobilizing the entire population for war, while revolutionary commissioners ensured that soldiers fought for the principles of liberty and equality rather than traditional loyalties to dynasty or religion. The victories at Fleurus and other battles in 1794 saved the Republic from foreign invasion while spreading revolutionary ideas throughout Europe. French armies carried with them not just military power, but revolutionary ideology, creating satellite republics and inspiring democratic movements in countries across Europe. The export of revolution through military conquest would become a defining feature of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. The Thermidorian reaction of July 27, 1794. 9. Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, which overthrew Robespierre and ended the Terror, was carried out by convention members who feared that they would be the next victims of revolutionary justice. Robespierre's attempt to purge his critics had finally provoked the coalition of moderate and corrupt revolutionaries who formed a majority in the convention and were determined to save themselves from the guillotine. The execution of Robespierre and his followers on July 28, 1794, marked the end of the most radical phase of the revolution and the beginning of a more moderate period that would eventually lead to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The crowd that had cheered previous executions watched Robespierre's death in relative silence, suggesting that even the Parisian sans-culottes had grown weary of revolutionary violence. The legacy of the Terror was profoundly ambiguous and continues to influence debates about revolution and political change. The terrorists had saved the Republic from foreign invasion and internal rebellion while implementing democratic reforms that benefited common people. But they had also created a precedent for ideological dictatorship that would inspire totalitarian movements for centuries to come. The question of whether revolutionary violence was necessary for the achievement of democratic goals or a betrayal of democratic principles would haunt progressive politics throughout the modern era. The Revolutionary Deluge, Liberty, Equality, and the Fall of Kings, 1789 to 1793. The French Revolution erupted in the summer of 1789 with a force that shattered not only the political structures of France, but the entire European understanding of legitimate government. What began as an attempt to solve the monarchy's financial problems quickly escalated into a complete transformation of society, challenging fundamental assumptions about authority, privilege, and human rights that had governed European civilization for centuries. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, provided the revolution with its most enduring symbol and demonstrated the explosive power of popular anger. When news reached Paris that the king had dismissed the popular finance minister Jacques Necker and was moving troops toward the capital, crowds gathered in the streets, convinced that royal forces were preparing to crush the National Assembly by force. The medieval fortress of the Bastille, which had become a hated symbol of royal arbitrary power, contained gunpowder desperately needed by the Parisian militia. The attack on the Bastille revealed the revolution's dual character from its very beginning. While bourgeois revolutionaries in the National Assembly debated constitutional principles, ordinary Parisians took direct action to defend the revolution through violence. The crowd that stormed the fortress included artisans, shopkeepers, and workers who had suffered from the economic crisis but were now inspired by revolutionary rhetoric about liberty and equality. Their willingness to risk their lives for abstract principles demonstrated how deeply Enlightenment ideas had penetrated French society. The aftermath of the Bastille's fall showed both the revolution's democratic impulses and its capacity for revenge. The fortress's governor, Bernard-René de Launay, who had tried to negotiate a peaceful surrender, was murdered by the crowd, his head paraded through the streets on a pike. This combination of idealistic goals with savage methods would characterize the revolution throughout its course, creating a pattern where noble aspirations were pursued through increasingly extreme means. The Great Fear that swept the French countryside in late July and early August transformed the revolution from an urban phenomenon into a national uprising. Rumors spread that aristocrats were hiring brigands to destroy peasant crops and restore feudalism by force. Terrified peasants armed themselves and attacked chateaux, burning feudal documents that recorded their obligations to noble lords. While the rumors proved false, the peasant uprising destroyed the feudal system more effectively than any decree could have accomplished. The National Assembly's response to rural violence revealed the revolutionary leadership's pragmatic wisdom. Rather than condemning the peasant attacks, the Assembly channeled popular anger into constructive reform by abolishing feudalism entirely on the night of August 4, 1789. In an extraordinary session that lasted until dawn, noble deputies voluntarily surrendered their privileges, creating what contemporaries called the magic of the night, when 1,000 years of feudal tradition vanished in a few hours. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, provided the revolution with its philosophical foundation and created one of history's most influential political documents. Drawing inspiration from the American Declaration of Independence, English Bill of Rights, and Enlightenment philosophy, the Declaration proclaimed universal principles that challenged the legitimacy of every existing government in Europe. Its assertion that men are born and remain free and equal in rights directly contradicted the aristocratic hierarchies that dominated European society. The Declaration's impact extended far beyond France's borders. Its principles inspired democratic movements throughout Europe and the Americas, while terrifying conservative rulers who recognized the threat to their authority. The document's universalist language, referring to the rights of man rather than Frenchmen, suggested that the Revolution's principles applied to all humanity, making it inherently expansionist and threatening to existing order everywhere. Women's participation in the Revolution challenged traditional gender roles while revealing the limits of revolutionary equality. The Women's March on Versailles on October 5–6, 1789, demonstrated female political activism on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of Parisian women, angered by bread shortages and convinced that the royal family was hoarding grain, marched to Versailles and forced the king and queen to return to Paris. This dramatic action effectively ended royal independence and placed the monarchy under popular surveillance. Yet despite women's crucial contributions to revolutionary success, the Declaration of Rights applied only to male citizens. Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Female Citizen, 1791, challenged this exclusion by demanding political equality for women, but her arguments were rejected by male revolutionaries who maintained traditional assumptions about women's political incapacity. This contradiction between universal principles and exclusionary practices would plague the revolution throughout its course. The revolution's relationship with the Catholic Church created some of its most lasting divisions. The civil constitution of the clergy, adopted in July 1790, attempted to reform the Church by making priests elected officials paid by the state rather than spiritual leaders owing allegiance to Rome. This seemingly practical measure struck at the heart of Catholic theology by subordinating spiritual authority to temporal power and requiring clergy to swear loyalty to the nation rather than the Pope. The clerical oath controversy split French society down the middle. About half of France's priests accepted the constitutional oath and became juring clergy, while the remainder refused and became non-juring or refractory clergy. This division created a parallel church structure that opposed the revolution while turning religious observance into a political act. Regions that rejected the constitutional church became centers of counter-revolutionary resistance, creating a religious political divide that would influence French politics for generations. The royal family's attempted flight to Varennes in June 1791 shattered remaining illusions about Louis XVI's commitment to the revolution. The king's effort to escape France and seek foreign assistance against his own people revealed his fundamental opposition to revolutionary changes. Although he was captured and returned to Paris, the flight destroyed his credibility and made the monarchy untenable in its existing form. The Varennes crisis radicalized the revolution by demonstrating that constitutional monarchy was impossible with Louis XVII. The discovery of the king's secret correspondence with foreign powers confirmed revolutionary suspicions about royal treachery while making war with European monarchies virtually inevitable. The revolution could no longer retreat to moderate positions when the king himself had rejected constitutional limitations on his power. The declaration of war against Austria in April 1792 marked a crucial turning point that transformed the revolution from an internal French affair into a European conflict. The Legislative Assembly, influenced by the Girondin faction who believed that war would expose domestic enemies and unite the nation, voted for war despite opposition from more cautious voices. This decision would have enormous consequences, as war pressures would drive the revolution toward increasing radicalism while creating the conditions for military dictatorship. The initial military disasters confirmed revolutionary fears about internal betrayal, while providing justification for extreme measures against suspected enemies. French armies, weakened by the emigration of noble officers and the disruption of traditional military hierarchy, suffered devastating defeats that brought enemy forces close to Paris. Popular anger at military failure focused on the royal family, who were suspected of secretly aiding the enemy cause. The insurrection of August 10, 1792, marked the end of the monarchy and the beginning of the revolution's most radical phase. When news arrived that the Duke of Brunswick's manifesto threatened to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed, Parisian crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace and massacred the Swiss guards who defended it. The Legislative Assembly, faced with accomplished facts, voted to suspend the king and call elections for a new national convention. The September massacres that followed revealed the revolution's descent into paranoid violence. Convinced that counter-revolutionary prisoners were plotting to escape and join enemy armies, Parisian crowds broke into prisons and murdered over 1,000 suspected enemies of the revolution. These killings, carried out with primitive weapons and lasting for several days, shocked Europe and demonstrated how quickly revolutionary idealism could degenerate into savage bloodlust. The trial and execution of Louis XVII in January 1793 eliminated any possibility of compromise with the old regime while committing the revolution to total transformation. The convention's decision to execute the king by a margin of a single vote created an irreversible break with the past, while making every revolutionary complicit in regicide. This act shocked European monarchies into forming a coalition against revolutionary France, while demonstrating that the revolution would stop at nothing to achieve its goals. The king's execution speech, in which he forgave his enemies and hoped his death would benefit France, provided a dignified end to a tragic figure. Louis XVI's personal failings had made him unsuitable for absolute monarchy, but his genuine desire to serve his people and his courage in facing death earned him a measure of historical sympathy. His execution marked not just the end of his life, but the death of the idea that kings ruled by divine right. By early 1793, the revolution had achieved a complete transformation of French society. Feudalism was abolished, the church was subordinated to the state, legal equality was established, and popular sovereignty was proclaimed. Yet these achievements came at enormous cost in terms of violence, division, and international isolation. The revolution had unleashed forces that its original leaders could not control, setting the stage for even more radical developments that would soon consume many of the revolutionaries themselves.